Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. I'm not looking for validation or trying to convince anyone. I just need to put this experience somewhere because it's been sitting with me for 25 years and I still think about it more than I should. This happened in the summer of 1994 when I was 12 years old. My family was camping at Huntsville State Park in the piney woods of East Texas. It was our annual summer trip. My parents, my little brother, and my aunt's family with my two cousins. We'd been going there since I was little. My cousin Jake was 16 and always acted like he was so grown up and knew everything. That morning he mentioned he'd found this awesome fishing spot on the far side of Lake Raven that none of the other campers knew about. He asked if I wanted to check it out with him. I wasn't super into fishing, but was bored of hanging around the campsite, listening to my parents talk about boring adult stuff. So I said yes. We borrowed my uncle's old aluminum rowboat after breakfast. I remember it was around 9 in the morning because my mum reminded me to be back for lunch at noon. The weather was perfect, not too hot yet, just warm enough that you didn't need a jacket. The lake was so calm it looked like glass, with fog still hanging over parts of it. Jake did most of the rowing since he was older and stronger. We were heading toward this narrow inlet on the far side of the lake. I remember Jake saying it led to these backwater areas where bigger fish would be. The whole time we were crossing the lake, everything felt so peaceful. There were a few other boats far off in the distance, but mostly it was just us and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. As we got closer to the inlet, I noticed how the trees seemed to crowd right up to the water's edge. The pines were so tall, they made me feel tiny. The inlet itself was maybe 30 feet wide, with cypress trees and their knees sticking out of the water near the banks. Jake was telling me to keep an eye out for water moccasins because they sometimes sun themselves on the cypress knees. We were maybe 20 yards from the entrance to the inlet when everything changed. It happened so fast. 1 second, everything was quiet, and the next, there was this explosion of birds from the trees to our right. Not just a few birds, dozens of them, all at once, like something had terrified them. It was so sudden I jumped and nearly tipped the boat. The sound was incredible, wings flapping, birds screeching. Jake stopped rowing and we both just stared. That's when I saw it. On the shoreline, maybe 50 feet ahead of us, something was moving. At first, I thought it was a person, because it was moving on 2 legs. But immediately, I knew that wasn't right. It was running along the bank, heading away from us toward the inlet. It was big, way bigger than any person I've ever seen. Tall, like maybe 7 feet, but it wasn't just the height. It was the build. This thing was massive, with broad shoulders and powerful-looking limbs, completely covered in dark hair, either black or really dark brown. The hair wasn't super long, but it covered its entire body. The way it moved is what I remember most vividly. It ran like a person would run, but different, more powerful. Each stride covered so much ground, its arms pumped at its sides like a runner's, but the movement seemed more deliberate, more forceful. It was booking it through the trees and underbrush like they weren't even there, ducking under branches without slowing down. Then it happened. The thing glanced back at us mid-stride. For just a second, maybe less, we made eye contact. Its face was dark and partially hidden by the hair, but I could see its eyes clearly. They were, I don't know how to explain it. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't exactly human either. There was intelligence there, and not aggression like I would have expected. What I saw was panic, pure panic. Like we had surprised it just as much as it had surprised us, and it was trying to get away. That split second of eye contact is burned into my brain forever. I literally felt my blood turn cold. I couldn't move, couldn't think. And then I started screaming. I couldn't stop myself. I just screamed and screamed. Jake yelled something like, "Holy shit!" and started rowing backward as fast as he could. The boat rocked violently. I genuinely thought we were going to flip over. Through my panic, I heard Jake saying, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" over and over. I was sobbing by this point, completely hysterical. I couldn't form words. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst out of my chest. I kept picturing those eyes looking at me. It felt like it had seen me, specifically, not just a person in a boat. That's what scared me the most. Jake was rowing like crazy, and the boat was cutting through the water faster than it probably ever had before. At some point, Jake shouted that something was splashing in the water behind us. I couldn't bring myself to turn around and look. I was convinced this thing was coming after us, and if I looked back and saw it swimming toward our boat, I might literally die of fear. The trip back across the lake is mostly a blur. Jake kept rowing without stopping. My hands were gripping the sides of the boat so tight they cramped up afterward. I remember the sound of the oars hitting the water and Jake's heavy breathing. I couldn't stop crying, but it had turned into this quiet, shaking sob rather than screaming. Things got even worse when we reached the shore. We were so panicked and disoriented that we ended up at the wrong part of the shoreline, nowhere near our campsite. We beached the boat at someone else's campsite, an older couple who looked alarmed when they saw the state we were in. The woman asked if we were okay, but I couldn't even look at her. Just seeing the shoreline, trees just like the ones where we'd seen the creature, sent me into another wave of panic. Jake did the talking. He thanked them and said we got spooked by something in the water, probably an alligator. He pulled me along as we walked the shoreline back to our campsite. I remember him saying, "Don't tell Mom and Dad what we saw. They won't believe us anyway." But I couldn't keep it in. As soon as we got back to our campsite, I broke down completely. My mom thought I'd been injured. Through sobs, I told them about what we'd seen. Jake backed me up, but I could tell he was downplaying it, probably embarrassed to admit how scared he'd been. My dad and uncle immediately went to check it out. They took the boat back across the lake, while my mom stayed with me. I was frantic the whole time they were gone, convinced something terrible would happen to them. They came back about an hour later saying they hadn't seen anything unusual, just some disturbed vegetation on the bank that could have been made by anything. My uncle suggested it was probably a black bear, though they're pretty rare in that part of Texas. My dad thought maybe a wild hog, though we both knew wild hogs don't run on two legs. I could tell they didn't believe us, or at least they were trying to rationalize what we'd seen. We stayed at the campsite for 2 more days. I refused to go anywhere near the lake. I had nightmares both nights, waking up in cold sweats. Even the sound of the wind in the pine trees made me jump. On the drive home, my mum suggested we not talk about the bear incident anymore because it was making me too upset. For years afterward, I tried to convince myself it was just a bear. I researched bears extensively, how they sometimes stand on their hind legs, how they can look almost human-like in certain positions. But I know what I saw. It wasn't standing occasionally. It was running on 2 legs the entire time, with a stride and motion, nothing like a bear's awkward 2-legged shuffle. I'm 37 years old now. I still live in East Texas, about an hour from Huntsville State Park. I've never gone back there. I've told this story to exactly 3 people in my adult life: my college roommate, my ex-husband, and my current partner. My ex thought it was hilarious and would bring it up at parties to embarrass me. My current partner is more understanding and doesn't ridicule me, but I can tell he thinks it was just a childhood imagination gone wild. But here's the thing. Jake and I have talked about it a few times as adults. He remembers it exactly as I do. Every detail matches. He's a petroleum engineer now, very logical, not prone to exaggeration. He has no explanation for what we saw. I've looked into Bigfoot sightings in East Texas over the years. There are more than you'd think, especially in the Piney Woods region. Some descriptions match what we saw perfectly. The height, the dark hair, the way it moved. I'm not saying that's definitely what it was, but I've never found another explanation that fits. What haunts me most isn't just that we saw something impossible. It's the moment our eyes met. There was recognition there, mutual fear. For that brief second, I wasn't looking at an animal. I was looking at something that knew exactly what I was and was just as terrified of me as I was of it. I still have dreams about those eyes sometimes. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams where I'm back in that boat. And instead of running away, the creature stops and turns fully toward me. In these dreams, it's like it wants to communicate something important, but I always wake up before I find out what. I don't know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe because as I get older, I'm less concerned with people thinking I'm crazy. Maybe because the memory feels like it's fading slightly, and writing it down helps me preserve it. Whatever it was I saw that day at Lake Raven, it changed something in me. It opened up the possibility that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we're willing to admit. I don't have any evidence. I don't have photos or footprints or hair samples. All I have is what I know I saw, and the absolute certainty that for a brief moment, something unexplainable looked back at me from the shores of that lake. I still don't go camping. I still get uncomfortable in dense forests. And to this day, when I hear a sudden eruption of birds taking flight, my blood runs cold, and I'm 12 years old again, frozen in terror in a rowboat on Lake Raven. Story 2. I still think about that day all the time. October 2nd, 2016. It's been almost 7 years, but I remember every detail like it happened yesterday. My friend Jen and I had planned a day trip to Leavenworth, you know, that cute Bavarian-themed town in Washington. We thought we'd check out the early fall colors, maybe do some shopping, grab some bratwurst. Just a normal Sunday drive. We left Seattle around 9 in the morning. It was unseasonably warm for October, like mid-70s with this crystal clear blue sky. Perfect driving weather. We'd been on Highway 2 for maybe an hour and a half, heading west towards Stevens Pass in Helens County. We were chatting about nothing important. Work drama, Jen's new boyfriend, normal stuff. When we hit that stretch past Cold Corner. For those who don't know the area, there's this part of Highway 2 where the road curves, and there's these bluffs that rise up on the right side, if you're heading west. There's not much between the road and the forest there. Just some gravelly shoulders and then trees. It's beautiful country, but pretty remote in spots. So we're driving, and I'm the one behind the wheel. Jen was messing with the radio, trying to find a station that wasn't just static. I remember we'd just been laughing about something stupid when I noticed what I thought was a person walking along one of those bluffs. "Hey, look at that," I said to Jen. "Someone's hiking up there." From a distance, maybe a quarter-mile away, it looked like a guy in a dark hoodie walking along the ridge. Nothing weird about that, right? Just someone out enjoying the nice weather. But something about the way it was moving caught my attention. The stride looked off somehow. Too fluid, too long. But I didn't think much of it yet. As we got closer, maybe 200 yards away, I started to slow down instinctively. Something didn't feel right. The person was moving in this weird, purposeful way. And it was big, like really big. "That's a tall dude," Jen said, finally noticing what I was looking at. But as we got closer, my brain started trying to process what I was actually seeing. This wasn't a person in a hoodie. This wasn't a person at all. First off, it was huge. I'm not exaggerating when I say it had to be between 7 and 8 feet tall. And it wasn't wearing clothes. It was covered in this thick black hair, not like fur exactly, more like really coarse human hair, but all over its body. The hair on top of its head formed this weird bushy peak, almost like a natural mohawk. Its arms were what really got me. They were proportionally way longer than a human's should be, and they swung in this exaggerated way as it walked. Not like someone hiking, but like, I don't even know how to describe it. Deliberate, powerful. The muscle definition was visible even through the hair. This wasn't some fat, lumbering thing. It was lean, athletic-looking, like a bodybuilder covered in hair. "Lisa!" Jen whispered beside me. "What the fuck is that?" I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone completely dry. I'd slowed the car down to maybe 30 mph, and we were just staring. Part of me wanted to floor it and get the hell out of there, but a bigger part was frozen in disbelief. When we were about 2 city blocks away, close enough that there was no mistaking what we were seeing, the thing stopped walking, just stopped dead in its tracks. And then, in this deliberate motion that still gives me nightmares, it turned its head and looked directly at us. I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It was lighter colored than the rest of its body, but still a dark brownish gray. The forehead jutted out prominently over these deep-set eyes. The nose was flatter than a human's, more like a gorilla, but not exactly. And its eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was something in them. Awareness, intelligence, I don't know. But they locked onto our car with a focused intensity that made my skin crawl. For maybe 5 seconds, though it felt like an eternity, it just stared at us. Not aggressively, not fearfully, just observing, assessing, like it was as curious about us as we were terrified of it. Then, with the same deliberate slowness, it turned away from the road and walked into the tree line. Not running, not hurrying, just this confident stride like it had all the time in the world. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the forest. I realized I'd been holding my breath only when my lungs started burning. I gulped in air and looked over at Jen. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "Did we just—" she started. "Yeah," I nodded. "We did." "That was a fucking Bigfoot," she said, her voice shaking. "An actual Bigfoot." I pulled the car over to the shoulder, my hands trembling so badly I could barely steer. For a few minutes we just sat there in silence, processing. I kept replaying what I'd seen, trying to rationalize it. Could it have been a bear walking upright? No. The proportions were all wrong. A person in a costume, in the middle of nowhere on a Sunday morning. And no costume could capture that fluid movement, that muscle definition. "We have to go back," Jen said suddenly. "We have to try to see it again, maybe get a picture." I looked at her like she was insane. "Are you serious? Go looking for that thing. Lisa, do you realize what we just saw? This is huge. No one will believe us without evidence." She had a point. Even as we sat there, the encounter was already starting to feel dreamlike, impossible. But the thought of actually seeking this creature out made my stomach turn. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said. "What if it's dangerous? What if it's not alone?" Jen bit her lip, clearly torn between curiosity and common sense. Finally, she agreed that maybe charging into the woods after an 8-foot-tall unknown creature wasn't the smartest move. Instead, we decided to continue on to Leavenworth, but the mood had completely changed. We barely spoke for the next 20 minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. The beautiful scenery that had delighted us earlier now felt ominous, the dense forests potentially hiding more creatures watching us pass. When we hit the next small town, I pulled into a gas station, partly because we needed fuel, but mostly because I needed to be around other normal humans. While I was pumping gas, Jen went inside to use the bathroom. When she came back, she was talking to a guy in a Forest Service uniform. "Lisa," she called, waving me over. "This is Mark. He works for the Forest Service. I told him what we saw." I felt a flash of embarrassment. Great. Now some random forest ranger was going to think we were a couple of hysterical city women who couldn't tell a bear from a bush. But to my surprise, Mark wasn't laughing or dismissive. "Can you tell me exactly where you saw this?" he asked, his expression serious. "Past Cold Corner, you said." I described the location as precisely as I could. He nodded, making notes on his phone. "We've had a few reports in that general area over the past few months," he said casually, like we were talking about deer sightings. "Similar descriptions too. Tall, dark-haired, moves quickly for its size. I felt a chill despite the warm day. You mean other people have seen it too? Recently? Mark looked up from his phone. More than you'd think. We don't publicize it, obviously. Causes all kinds of problems when we do. Thrill seekers, hoaxers, you name it. But yeah, there's been activity around there since at least last spring. What do you think it is? Jen asked. Mark shrugged. Officially, nothing. No such thing as Bigfoot according to the Forest Service. Unofficially, I've worked these forests for 12 years and there are things out there I can't explain. Things I've seen myself that don't make sense. He took our contact information and promised to pass it along to a colleague who keeps track of these things. Then he advised us to be careful driving back through that area, especially if we were returning after dark. They're not usually aggressive, he added as an afterthought, but they're wild animals if that's what they are. Unpredictable. Best to keep your distance. The casual way he said it, like he was warning us about cougar sightings, made the whole thing even more unsettling. We did make it to Leavenworth eventually, but neither of us was in the mood for shopping or sightseeing anymore. We sat at an outdoor cafe, picking at our food and speaking in low voices about what we'd seen. Do you think there are more of them? Jen asked. A whole community living in the mountains. The thought had occurred to me too. If this wasn't some one-off mutant or the last of its kind, if there were enough of them to maintain a breeding population, they'd have to be incredibly good at avoiding detection, which meant they were intelligent, organized. I don't know, I admitted. But if what Mark said is true, they've managed to stay hidden despite people knowing they're there. That's scary in its own way. We left Leavenworth earlier than planned. Neither of us wanted to drive back through Stevens Pass after dark, so we hit the road around 4 in the afternoon. The sun was still high, but there was this tension in the car that hadn't been there on the drive out. Every shadow in the trees, every movement glimpsed from the corner of my eye made my heart rate spike. As we approached the area where we'd had our sighting, we both fell silent. I had this powerful urge to speed up, to get through this stretch of road as quickly as possible. But at the same time, I couldn't help scanning the tree line, wondering if it, or something like it, was watching us right now. We didn't see anything unusual on the return journey. No tall figures on the bluffs, no eyes watching from the forest. But that almost made it worse. The creature had vanished so completely, moved so silently into dense forest. How many times had I driven this road before, completely oblivious to what might be watching from just beyond the trees? When we got back to Seattle that evening, we tried to talk it through logically. We questioned each other's memories, tried to find inconsistencies or explanations. But our accounts matched perfectly, and neither of us could come up with a rational alternative to what we'd seen. We have to go back, Jen said eventually. With cameras this time, maybe even camping gear, we could stake the place out. I wasn't sure how I felt about that idea. Part of me wanted proof, something tangible to validate what we'd experienced. But a bigger part was afraid, not just of the creature itself, but of what finding proof might mean, how it would change everything. In the end, we never did go back specifically to look for it. Jen moved to Portland for work a few months later, and I still drive Highway 2 occasionally, but I always feel a prickle of awareness when I pass that stretch of road. I find myself scanning the bluffs, the forest edges, wondering. I've done a lot of research since then, joined online forums, read books, watched documentaries. Turns out the Stevens Pass area has a long history of sightings going back decades. Native American legends talk about similar creatures. The details match up with what we saw, the height, the hair, the way it moved. I've connected with a few other people who've had sightings in Washington state. Most are reluctant to talk publicly about their experiences. They're normal, rational people who saw something they can't explain, and they're afraid of being ridiculed or dismissed. I get it. I haven't told many people about what Jen and I saw either. Sometimes I wonder if it recognized us as humans, if it knew we were watching it. The way it turned and looked directly at us, that wasn't random. It knew we were there. It assessed us and then decided we weren't a threat, or maybe we weren't interesting enough to bother with. I still check local news for any reports of unusual sightings in that area. Last year, a hiker went missing near Stevens Pass for 3 days. When they found him, he was dehydrated and disoriented, but physically unharmed. He claimed he'd been watched the entire time he was lost, that he could feel eyes on him, but never saw what was tracking him. The news wrote it off as the hallucinations of a man suffering from exposure. But I wonder. I'm not trying to convince anyone that Bigfoot exists. I'm not even fully convinced myself, despite what I saw. But I know this. Something tall, bipedal, and decidedly not human lives in those mountains. Something intelligent enough to avoid detection, strong enough to survive in wilderness, and curious enough to observe us when it thinks we're not looking. And every time I drive Highway 2 now, I keep my eyes on the road and try not to look at the tree line, because I'm not sure I want to know what might be looking back. Story 3. I've been debating whether to post this for years. I'm not the type who believes in monsters or goes looking for the unexplained. I'm just a regular guy who loves mountain biking and the outdoors. What happened to me on August 27, 2008 changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness I've spent most of my life exploring. I had the day off work and decided to hit some trails northwest of Chelan, Washington. It was one of those perfect late summer days, not too hot, clear skies, just ideal for riding. I'd been on this particular trail a few times before. It doesn't even have a name, just a local spot about 17 miles outside town that other bikers occasionally use. I like it because it's challenging but not killer, with some decent elevation changes and technical sections that keep things interesting. I'd been riding for about 2 hours, taking my time, enjoying being away from emails and phone calls. The trail follows this ridgeline for a while, with some pretty spectacular views of the valley below. I remember feeling completely at peace, that perfect state where you're focused on the trail, but also just soaking in the silence and the smell of pine. I came around this left bend in the trail. I remember it clearly because there's this gnarly root that juts out that you have to watch for. I was leaning into the turn when something caught my eye up on the slope to my left. At first, my brain just registered movement, something big moving through the trees. I hit my brakes immediately. The sound of my tires skidding on dirt seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. What I saw next, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. About 50 yards up the slope was this creature. There's no other word for it. It was tall, and I mean tall. I'm 6 foot even, and this thing had to be at least 8 feet, maybe more. Dark brown hair covered its entire body, not fur like a bear, but longer hair, almost shaggy. And it was moving on 2 legs, not shuffling or lumbering, but running, smoothly, purposefully, like an athlete. The way it moved is what really got to me. Despite its massive size, it was incredibly fast and agile. It was running away from the exposed ridgeline toward the northwest, weaving through trees and over rocky terrain like it was nothing. No noise except for the occasional snap of a branch. No heavy breathing, no grunting. Just this huge bipedal figure moving through the forest with more grace than should be physically possible for something that size. I sat there frozen on my bike for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 to 15 seconds, watching it disappear into the thicker forest. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking on the handlebars. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to grab my phone to take a picture, but honestly, I was too stunned to even think about moving. After it disappeared from view, I just sat there for a minute, trying to process what I'd seen. My first thought was bear, obviously. I've encountered black bears on trails before, but this wasn't a bear. Bears don't run on two legs like that. They might stand up momentarily, but they don't sprint through difficult terrain upright. And the proportions were all wrong. Long arms, broad shoulders, a distinct neck and head. The way it moved was just human-like, but not human at all. Once I got my breathing under control, I dropped my bike right there on the trail and walked over to where the creature had crossed. The ground was pretty densely covered with alpine grasses and low shrubs, the kind that grow at higher elevations. I looked for tracks, but couldn't find anything definitive. The vegetation was too thick and springy, quickly bouncing back after being stepped on. But what was clear was the path it had taken. There was a subtle disturbance in the vegetation, a slight parting of the grass where something heavy had recently passed through. I followed this disturbance with my eyes up the slope and could see how the thing had navigated between trees and around obstacles. It had chosen the most efficient path through difficult terrain, which again struck me as weirdly intelligent. I stood there for a while, just staring into the forest where it had disappeared. The woods suddenly felt different to me. No longer just a playground for my bike rides, but something deeper and more mysterious. I felt like I was being watched, though I never saw anything else move. My hands were still shaking as I got back on my bike. I kept telling myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe it was some guy in a costume. But who would be up here, miles from anywhere, in a realistic-looking costume, running at incredible speed through difficult mountain terrain? That made no sense. A bear? Definitely not. The bipedal movement was sustained and natural, not like a bear awkwardly standing up. I couldn't shake the feeling of how wrong it was, like seeing something your brain can't quite categorize. It's hard to explain the feeling of seeing something that shouldn't exist according to everything you've been taught. I tried to continue my ride, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might be hiding something massive. I ended up cutting my ride short and heading back to my truck much earlier than planned. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying those 10 to 15 seconds in my head. I told myself I must have been mistaken, that I'd seen a bear or an elk from a weird angle, but deep down, I knew what I saw. The next day, I decided to go back. Not to the same trail, I wasn't ready for that, but to another area nearby. I guess I was trying to prove to myself that the woods were still normal, that I could still enjoy mountain biking without freaking out. About an hour into that ride, I came around a corner and saw a black bear about 30 yards ahead on the trail. It looked up at me, then ambled off into the woods. A normal wildlife encounter, but seeing that bear cemented something in my mind. The contrast between the bear's movement, the way it lumbered on all fours, its distinctive profile and proportions, and what I'd seen the day before was stark. They were nothing alike, not even close. After that day, I started researching online. I was hesitant to use certain terms in my searches at first. It felt ridiculous, but eventually I typed Sasquatch sightings Washington State into Google. I was shocked by how many reports existed from the Cascades and the areas around Helens specifically. Some of the descriptions matched what I saw with eerie similarity, particularly regarding the creature's fluid movement and speed. I've told very few people about this. My girlfriend at the time thought I was joking, then got concerned when she realized I was serious. My brother was the only one who didn't immediately dismiss it. He's always been into unexplained phenomena, but even he had questions I couldn't answer. I still go mountain biking regularly. I even use that same trail system sometimes, though I haven't returned to that specific ridge-line trail. I find myself constantly scanning the forest now when I ride, especially in remote areas. Every ride has this undercurrent of tension that wasn't there before. What bothers me most isn't just what I saw, but how it made me question everything else. If this creature exists, this thing that's supposedly just a myth, a campfire story. What else might be out there that we don't know about? How much of our world remains unexplained? I've analyzed this 1,000 times in my head. Could it have been a person? No way. Too tall, too fast, completely covered in hair. A bear? Absolutely not. Wrong movement pattern, wrong proportions, some other known animal. Nothing native to Washington matches what I saw. The thing that gets me is how it moved with such purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going and what it was doing. This wasn't a confused animal wandering around. It was traveling with intent, using the terrain to its advantage, staying hidden in the tree line whenever possible. It's been over 15 years now, and I still think about it almost daily. I find myself looking at the forest differently when I drive past them. I imagine dense woods filled with pathways and territories we know nothing about, creatures moving silently just beyond our perception. It's humbling and terrifying at the same time. Sometimes I wonder if it saw me before I saw it. If it was trying to stay hidden and I just happened to catch it in a moment of exposure as it crossed that ridge line. Was it as surprised to see me as I was to see it? Did it tell others of its kind about the human on the strange rolling contraption it encountered that day? I've never had another sighting, despite spending hundreds more hours in those same mountains over the years. Part of me hopes I never do, while another part desperately wants confirmation that I didn't imagine or misinterpret what I saw. That tension between wanting to know and being afraid to know has become a constant companion. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it either if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw that day. It wasn't a bear, a moose, an elk, or a person. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. When I close my eyes, I can still see it perfectly. The fluid movement, the massive frame, the dark brown hair catching sunlight as it moved between shadows. I can still feel that moment of shock and disbelief, the way my body froze and my mind raced. Some experiences change you forever. For me, it was those 15 seconds on a nameless trail outside Helens. I still ride those mountains. I still love the outdoors. But now I understand that the wilderness holds secrets we've barely begun to discover. And sometimes, if you're in the right place at exactly the right moment, those secrets briefly reveal themselves before disappearing back into the unknown. Story 4. I still think about that day all the time. August 23rd, 2007. It's etched into my mind like it happened yesterday, not 16 years ago. My wife Janet and I were taking a much-needed vacation in Washington State. We'd planned this trip for months, the Lady of the Lake tour from Helens to Stehekin. Everyone told us the views were incredible, and we were both excited to disconnect from the world for a few days. We boarded the boat early that morning. It was a beautiful day, clear blue skies, perfect temperature, that crisp mountain air that just feels clean in your lungs. We found seats on the upper deck, where we could see everything. Janet had brought a bird-watching guide, and I had my new digital camera I'd splurged on specifically for this trip. I remember being so proud of that camera, a Canon with a decent zoom that cost me nearly a month's savings. The boat journey was peaceful. The water was this deep, almost unnatural blue that you only see in mountain lakes. We were chatting with other tourists, taking pictures of the mountains rising sharply from the shoreline. Everything was normal, just a perfect day on vacation with my wife. About halfway through the journey, the captain announced we'd be making a stop at a place called Lucerne to drop off some firefighters. I wasn't expecting this stop, but apparently there had been some wildfires in the area that needed attention. The boat slowed and docked at this tiny landing. Honestly, just a small wooden dock jutting out into the lake. Everyone's attention turned to the firefighters disembarking. There were about 70 of them, all geared up with their equipment. It was quite the operation, and most of the passengers were watching them, taking pictures, even cheering them on. Janet was standing by the railing, waving at them like they were soldiers going off to war. I remember looking away from the firefighters for a moment, just scanning the shoreline, when I noticed something moving where this small creek, Holden Creek, I later found out, emptied into the lake. At first glance, I thought it might be a bear. We'd been warned there were black bears in the area, but something about the movement caught my eye. "Janet," I said, nudging her arm, "look over there by that creek." She turned, following my pointing finger. There was something large and dark moving along the shoreline. It was partially obscured by some brush, but even from that distance, we could tell it was big. "What is that?" Janet whispered, squinting. "It looks like... God, Robert, it looks like an orangutan or something, but it's walking upright." I remember feeling this cold sensation wash over me. An orangutan in Washington State. That made no sense, but she wasn't wrong. There was something distinctly ape-like about the figure. I grabbed my camera immediately. My hands were shaking slightly as I turned it on and zoomed in. The figure was moving away from the shore now, heading back toward the tree line. Through my camera's viewfinder, I could see it much clearer, and what I saw made my mouth go dry. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I recognized. It had dark brown hair, almost black, covering its entire body. It was walking upright on two legs, but not like a human walks. It had this strange, loping gait that was somehow both awkward and fluid. Its arms were unusually long, swinging at its sides as it moved. "Are you seeing this?" I hissed to Janet, not taking my eyes off the viewfinder. "Yes," she whispered back. "Robert, what is that thing?" I snapped a picture, then another, then a third in quick succession, desperate to capture what I was seeing. The creature was already disappearing into the trees. Based on the trees around it, I estimated it stood somewhere between 7 and 8 feet tall. It was massive, easily 400 pounds or more, but moved with a deliberate, almost careful precision. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds. Then it was gone, disappeared into the dense forest that climbed up from the shoreline. I lowered my camera, feeling like I couldn't catch my breath. Janet was gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. "Did you get it?" she asked. "I think so," I said. "I got 3 shots." We both stood there, staring at the empty shoreline. The boat's engines rumbled as we pulled away from the dock. All around us, people were still chatting about the firefighters, completely oblivious to what we'd just witnessed. I looked around, wondering if anyone else had seen it, but everyone's attention had been focused on the dock, on the firefighters. We seemed to be the only ones who had been looking in that direction at that precise moment. "We should tell someone," Janet said. "Tell them what? That we saw Bigfoot?" I laughed nervously, but the word hung in the air between us. That's exactly what we both were thinking, even if neither of us wanted to say it outright. "Maybe it was just a bear," she offered, but I could tell she didn't believe that any more than I did. "Bears don't walk upright like that," I said. "Not for that long, and the proportions were all wrong. Did you see how long its arms were?" For the rest of the journey to Stehekin, Janet and I sat close together, speaking in hushed tones about what we'd seen. I kept wanting to check the photos, but something held me back. Maybe I was afraid they wouldn't show anything, that I'd convinced myself I'd seen something that wasn't really there. Or maybe I was more afraid that they would show something, confirming what I already knew deep down. We reached Stehekin in the late afternoon. It's this tiny remote community that's not accessible by road. You can only get there by boat or float plane. We checked into our small cabin, and as soon as the door closed behind us, I pulled out my camera. "Let's see what we got," I said, turning it on and finding the images I'd taken. The first picture showed the shoreline, but it was too far away to make out details. The second was similar, though I could see a dark shape that could have been anything, a shadow, a boulder, maybe just a gap in the trees. The third picture, though, I zoomed in as much as the camera would allow. There, at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. It was partly obscured by foliage, but I could clearly make out a massive hair-covered form. The way it stood, the proportions of its body, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal that should be in those woods. Janet was looking over my shoulder, her breath catching. "Robert," she whispered, "that's it. That's what we saw." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The image was grainy when zoomed in that far, but it was unmistakably the same creature we'd seen from the boat. I felt a weird mix of vindication and dread. We hadn't imagined it. Whatever it was real. That night we barely slept. Our cabin had large windows facing the forest, and every shadow, every rustle in the darkness had us on edge. Janet kept asking if I thought it could have followed us somehow, which was ridiculous given we were on a boat, but fear isn't rational. I kept thinking about how remote Stehekin was. No roads in or out. If something happened here, help was a long way off. The next morning, over breakfast, I cautiously brought up what we'd seen to the lodge owner, a weathered older man named Bill, who'd lived in Stehekin for decades. "Saw something strange on the way in?" I said casually. "Near Lucerne, where the boat stopped. Something big moving in the woods." Bill barely looked up from his coffee. "Probably a bear. Got lots of them around here." "It was walking on two legs," Janet added, "the whole time we watched it." That got his attention. Bill's eyes flickered to meet hers, then mine. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "Some things in these mountains best left alone," he finally said. "Been here 40 years, seen a lot of strange things. People who live here, we don't talk much about it. Tourists come and go, but we gotta live with what's out there." His response sent a chill through me. He didn't ask us what we thought we'd seen. He didn't laugh or tell us we were mistaken. It was almost like he knew exactly what we were talking about, but didn't want to acknowledge it directly. We spent 3 more days in Stehekin, hiking the trails close to the settlement, but never venturing too far into the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time we entered the forest, I felt eyes on us. Janet felt it too. I could tell by how jumpy she was, how she kept looking over her shoulder. On our last night, I was sitting on the cabin's porch while Janet was inside packing. The sun had just set, leaving that blue twilight that makes everything look slightly unreal. I was staring at the tree line, maybe 100 yards away, when I saw movement. At first, it was just a shifting of shadows. Then I made out a form, the same form we'd seen from the boat. It was standing just inside the tree line, partially hidden by a large pine. Even in the dim light, I could see it was watching me. I froze, unable to call out, unable to move. It was massive, much larger than a human, its silhouette unmistakable against the darker forest behind it. We stared at each other across that short span of open ground for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Then it stepped back, melting into the darkness of the forest with surprising grace for something so large. I sat there, heart pounding in my ears, until Janet called me inside. I never told her about that second sighting. I don't know why. Maybe I was trying to protect her, or maybe I was trying to convince myself it hadn't happened. We left Stehekin the next morning, both of us visibly relieved to be on the boat heading back to civilization. When we got home, I transferred the photos to my computer, enhancing them as best I could. The creature was there in that third image, no doubt about it. I researched extensively over the next few months, looking into Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest. What I found surprised me. Not just the number of sightings, but the consistency in the descriptions. What we saw matched almost perfectly with countless other reports from that region. I debated posting the pictures online, but ultimately decided against it. I'd seen how Bigfoot evidence gets torn apart, how witnesses get ridiculed. Plus, there was something personal about the experience, something I didn't want to subject to public scrutiny. I've only shared this story with a handful of people over the years. Some believe me, some don't. I don't really care either way. I know what I saw. Janet and I both do. Sometimes I think about how perfect that moment was for an encounter. A boat full of people, distracted by firefighters, a remote location accessible only by boat or plane, making a hoax nearly impossible. If someone wanted to move around these wilderness areas without being seen by humans, that's exactly how they do it, staying far from roads, using the natural terrain for cover, only emerging when they thought they were safe. I still have those pictures. I still look at them sometimes, especially that third one, and I still wonder about that creature, what it was, how it lives out there in those remote forests, how many of them might be hiding in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. And sometimes, on dark nights when I can't sleep, I remember those eyes watching me from the tree line in Stehekin, and I wonder if it was as curious about me as I was about it. I wonder if somewhere in those mountains, that creature is still there, still avoiding human contact, still living in a world increasingly encroached upon by our own. One thing I know for certain, the wilderness holds secrets we've barely begun to understand. I've seen one of them with my own eyes, and nothing anyone says will ever convince me otherwise. Story 5. I've never really told many people about this. I mean, who would believe me? I barely believe it myself, even though I saw it with my own eyes. But after bottling this up for so long, I need to get it off my chest. This happened back in August of 2004, August 7th to be exact. It was a Saturday morning, and I was driving on Highway 2 toward Leavenworth, Washington. I remember it was a beautiful day, somewhere between 10 and 11 in the morning. The sun was shining, and I had my windows rolled down to enjoy the mountain air. I was heading to Leavenworth for their summer festival. They have these cute little Bavarian-themed events, and I wanted to pick up some handmade crafts for my mum's birthday. The drive was peaceful. Not much traffic on the road that morning, just me and a few other cars spread out. I was about 10 minutes outside of Leavenworth when everything happened. I was following this blue Honda CR-V, keeping a good distance behind them, just cruising and enjoying the scenery. The mountains around that area are gorgeous, all pine trees and rocky outcroppings. Then, out of nowhere, the Honda's brake lights flared up. They slammed on their brakes so suddenly that I had to hit mine hard too. My seatbelt locked up across my chest, and my coffee tumbled off the passenger seat onto the floor. I remember feeling that rush of adrenaline you get when you think you're about to crash. My heart was pounding, but we didn't crash. I stopped in time, maybe 15 feet behind the Honda. At first I was annoyed, like, why would they stop so suddenly on a highway? I thought maybe a deer had jumped out or something. That's common enough in that area. I was about to honk when I saw it. Something was crossing the road from the right side. I couldn't see the front of it because of the angle and the Honda blocking part of my view, but I could see its back as it passed. It was tall, way taller than a person. I'm not good with estimating heights, but definitely over 7 feet, maybe even 8. And it was dark brown, but with this strange golden highlight where the sun hit its coat. Not fur exactly, more like hair, long hair. The thing that struck me most was how it moved. Bears lumber, you know? They're kind of awkward when they walk upright. This thing wasn't lumbering. It was striding, purposeful, smooth, 2 legs, like a person, but not. It took maybe 5 or 6 steps to cross the entire highway. That's how big its stride was. And then it just disappeared into the bushes on the left side of the road. The whole thing lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it was gone. The blue Honda sat there for maybe another 5 seconds, then slowly started driving again. I followed, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I kept looking to my left, trying to see if I could spot where it went, but the underbrush was thick. Nothing moved. When I got to Leavenworth, I was still so shaken that I ended up just sitting in my car in the parking lot for like 20 minutes. I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. I remember thinking, that had to be a bear, right? Just a really big bear walking funny? But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I've seen bears before, this wasn't that. I didn't tell anyone that day. I wandered around the festival in a daze, barely noticing the crafts or the food or the music. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone in a costume. But who wears a costume in the middle of nowhere on a highway? And it was way too tall. moved too naturally to be someone in a suit. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing it cross the road every time I closed my eyes. The smooth stride, the impossible height, the way the sunlight glinted off its dark brown coat. The next day, I started researching bears online. I looked up black bears, brown bears, all the species that might be in Washington state. I watched videos of them walking both on all fours and upright. None of them matched what I saw. Bears are bulky, wide. This thing was tall and relatively thin by comparison, and the way it walked was just wrong for a bear. That's when I started considering other possibilities. I typed "tall, hairy creature Washington state" into Google, and well, you can guess what came up. Sasquatch, Bigfoot. I'd always thought those were just stories, myths. I'd laughed at those blurry photos and the History Channel specials. I wasn't laughing anymore. I read accounts from other people who claimed to have seen similar things. Some of the details matched exactly what I saw: the height, the stride, the coloring. It was unsettling to realize I wasn't alone, but also somewhat validating. I wasn't crazy. Other people had seen this too, but I still kept it to myself. I mean, how do you casually bring that up? Hey, so I think I saw Bigfoot on my way to Leavenworth. People would think I was nuts. My family would worry about me. My friends would laugh. So I stayed quiet. About a week later, I got curious enough to drive back to that same stretch of highway. I don't know what I expected to find. Footprints, hair samples, some kind of proof. It was a stupid idea, and I knew it, but I had to go. I found approximately where it had happened and pulled over onto the shoulder. The forest seemed darker and more ominous than it had that sunny morning. I stood by my car for a few minutes, just looking into the trees, half expecting to see something looking back. Nothing did, thank God. I walked a little ways into the forest on the left side, where it had disappeared. The underbrush was thick, but there was a sort of natural path, maybe an animal trail, leading deeper in. I followed it for maybe 50 feet before my courage ran out. The forest was too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just silence. I hurried back to my car and got the hell out of there. Over the next few months, I kept researching. I found online forums where people shared their encounters. Some sounded crazy or made up, but others were like mine. Simple, straightforward sightings that changed how they viewed the world. I never posted my own story, just read others. I did try to find out if the people in the blue Honda had reported seeing anything. I checked local newspapers, online forums, even called the ranger station once to ask if there had been any unusual wildlife sightings reported on August 7th. Nothing. Either they hadn't reported it either, or they'd seen something different than I had. The thing that still bothers me most is the casual way it crossed the road. Like it knew exactly where it was going. Like it did this all the time. How many times had it crossed that same stretch of highway when no cars were around? How long had it been living in those woods? Were there more? It's been years now, and I've only told a handful of people. Most react with skepticism or awkward laughter. One friend suggested I might have experienced highway hypnosis, like a mini hallucination from driving too long, but I hadn't been driving that long, and I know what I saw. I've been back to Leavenworth many times since then. Every time I drive that stretch of Highway 2, I slow down a little, scanning the trees on both sides. I've never seen it again, but I always feel like I'm being watched. You know what's weird? That section of forest doesn't feel the same anymore. It used to just be pretty scenery. Now it feels alive somehow. Aware. Like there's something intelligent hiding just behind the tree line, watching the cars go by, deciding who gets to see it and who doesn't. Sometimes I wonder about the people in the blue Honda. Do they lie awake at night too, questioning what they saw? Did they get a better look at it? Did they see its face? Part of me hopes they did, so I'm not alone in this. Another part of me is glad I only saw its back. I'm not sure I could handle knowing what its face looked like. The more time passes, the more I doubt myself. Memory is a funny thing. It changes, gets corrupted, but certain details remain crystal clear. The golden highlights in its dark brown hair when the sun hit it just right. The impossible height. The smooth, purposeful stride. Those things I'll never forget. I've read that the Pacific Northwest has more Sasquatch sightings than anywhere else in the country. Some Native American tribes in the region have stories about wild men of the forest going back centuries. I never paid attention to any of that before. Now I can't stop thinking about it. Last year, I was at a dinner party, and somehow the conversation turned to unexplained experiences. People were sharing ghost stories, weird coincidences, that sort of thing. I had a few drinks in me and almost told this story. The words were right there on my tongue. But at the last second, I swallowed them back. I'm still not ready for the disbelief, the judgment. Maybe I never will be. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a bear. Life would be simpler that way. But then I remember exactly how it moved, how it held itself, and I know that's not true. There are things in this world that we haven't properly documented, things that live on the edges of our civilization, only occasionally crossing paths with us. I drive with a dash cam now, just in case. Lightning probably won't strike twice, but if it does, I want proof. Not just for others, but for myself too. To know once and for all that I'm not crazy, that what I saw that sunny August morning was real. The rational part of my brain still tries to explain it away. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion created by the light and shadows. Maybe it was a man in a ghillie suit, though who would wear one of those in summer and why? Maybe it was just a really, really unusual bear, but deep down, I know better. I know what I saw. I still go hiking in Washington State. My friends think I'm brave to go alone, but I'm not. I'm careful now. I make noise on the trail. I carry bear spray. I don't hike at dawn or dusk. And I always have this feeling in the back of my neck, this prickling awareness that I might not be alone out there. Not every unidentified creature in the woods is dangerous, I tell myself. Whatever I saw didn't seem aggressive. It was just going somewhere, crossing a road, living its life. It didn't seem to care about the cars or the people in them. We were just obstacles in its path, not worth more than a moment's pause. And maybe that's what unsettles me the most. Not that it exists, but that it exists so completely separate from us, so unconcerned with human presence, a whole other intelligence sharing our world, staying hidden, watching us from the trees as we drive by, oblivious. At least, most of us are oblivious. I'm not anymore, and sometimes I wish I still was. Story 6. I still can't make sense of what I saw that winter day in '73. Every time I think about it, my skin crawls and I get this weird tightness in my chest. I've only told a few people about it over the years, and most of them thought I was bullshitting them or that I'd had too much to drink. But I know what I saw. I was stone cold sober, and it's burned into my memory like a brand. It was early December 1973. I was 26 then, young and stupid, riding my Harley Sportster through the back roads of Washington State to meet up with some buddies who were camping out in a trailer near Wenatchee. They'd been hunting for a few days and invited me to join them for the weekend. I was working construction back then in Seattle, and after a brutal week on the job, I was looking forward to kicking back, drinking some beers, and swapping stories around a fire. I remember it was cold as hell that day, maybe 20 degrees. I was bundled up in my heaviest leather jacket, thermal underwear, and these thick gloves my then girlfriend had given me for my birthday. Even with all that gear, the wind cut through me like a knife as I rode. My face was numb despite the full-face helmet, and I kept thinking I was an idiot for not taking my truck instead. The ride took about 3 hours. As the afternoon wore on, a light snow began to fall, and a thin fog started rolling in. Nothing too heavy, but enough to make me slow down and pay extra attention to the winding roads. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, and that strange half-light of dusk was settling in. You know the kind, where everything looks a little off, like the world is holding its breath. I finally pulled off the main highway onto this unpaved service road that led to the clearing where my friends had set up camp. Their directions had been pretty vague. Turn at the big pine with the bent top, go about 2 miles, then look for our truck near a clearing. But somehow I found it. The road was rutted and icy in spots, making my bike slide a little. My hands were so damn cold, they were practically frozen to the handlebars. After bumping along for what felt like forever, I spotted Paul's blue Ford pickup parked at the edge of a small clearing. Their trailer was set up about 50 yards beyond it, one of those old airstreams that looked like a silver bullet. Smoke was coming from a metal chimney pipe they'd rigged up, and I could see a lantern glowing inside. The sight of it was like heaven after that miserable ride. I pulled up next to the truck, killed the engine, and just sat there for a minute, trying to get some feeling back in my extremities. The sudden silence after hours of engine noise was almost shocking. All I could hear was the ping of my cooling bike and the wind rustling through the pines. The air smelled of snow and wood smoke. That's when I noticed it. Something moving on the hillside across from the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe a large deer. The hillside was about 250 yards away, an open expanse of snow-covered ground that led up to a dense line of evergreens. The fog was drifting across in thin patches, which made visibility tricky. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was looking at something walking upright. My first thought was that it was one of my buddies coming back from hunting, but something wasn't right about the way it moved. Its stride was too long, too fluid for someone trudging through snow. And it was big, way too big to be any of my friends. I got off my bike, still watching this figure. I didn't call out. Something instinctual kept me quiet, like the part of your brain that knows when to freeze when you're in danger. I just stood there, my helmet still on, watching this thing. It was dark against the white snow, and I could make out what looked like hair or fur covering its entire body. Not like a jacket or coat, this covered everything, including what should have been its face. It was massive, standing at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, and the build on it, Jesus, it was like looking at a linebacker who'd been pumped full of steroids, but even that doesn't capture it. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the arms long and thick. As I watched, it stopped walking and turned. It looked directly at me. I swear to God, even from that distance, I could feel it looking at me. There was an intelligence there, an awareness. It wasn't just some animal that had spotted movement. It knew I was a person, and it was sizing me up. My blood went cold, and not from the winter air. I couldn't move. We just stared at each other across that snowy expanse for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it turned and continued walking toward the tree line, with this strange rolling gait that ate up distance effortlessly. It would take a few steps, then stop and look back at me again, like it was making sure I was still there, or maybe warning me not to follow. Each time it did this, my heart hammered harder in my chest. I remember thinking this couldn't be a man. No human being moves like that or looks like that. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone in a snowsuit. But no snowsuit I'd ever seen looked like that, all dark and seemingly covered in hair. And the size. I've been around big guys my whole life working construction, and nobody is built like that. I tried to estimate its weight based on its height and build, and I kept coming up with a number that seemed impossible, 500 or 600 pounds at least. But it moved through the snow like it weighed nothing, not sinking deep like a person would. The light was fading fast now, and the fog was getting thicker, but I could still make out that dark shape as it reached the edge of the trees. It stopped one last time, turned fully toward me, and seemed to stare for several long seconds. Then it simply stepped into the timber and vanished. The moment it disappeared, the spell broke. I suddenly realized I'd been holding my breath, and my body was rigid with tension. My hands were shaking, not from cold anymore, but from pure adrenaline. I remember fumbling to get my helmet off, wanting to see more clearly, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. I stood there staring at the spot where it had disappeared, straining to see if it would emerge again. Part of me wanted to hop back on my bike and get the hell out of there. But another part, the stupid, curious part, almost wanted to walk over there and check for tracks. Before I could decide what to do, the trailer door banged open, and Paul's voice called out, "Dan, that you finally? Get your ass in here before you freeze to death." I turned toward the trailer, then looked back at the hillside one more time. Nothing but snow and fog and darkening forest. I picked up my duffel bag from the bike, my movements mechanical, and walked toward the light and warmth of the trailer. I felt like I was in a daze. Inside it was warm and cramped. Paul, Mike, and Steve were sitting around a small table playing cards, empty beer cans scattered around them. They were laughing about something, but their voices seemed distant, like I was hearing them through water. "Jesus, you look like you've seen a ghost," Mike said, pushing a beer toward me. "Ride that bad?" I took the beer automatically, but didn't drink it. Did any of you guys see anything weird out on that hillside across the clearing? They looked at each other, then at me. "What kind of weird?" Steve asked. I hesitated. How do you tell three rational men that you just saw what looked like Bigfoot without sounding like you've lost your mind? "I don't know. Something big, walking on two legs." Paul laughed. "Probably an elk. They can look weird when they're on a hillside. Perspective gets all screwed up." "It wasn't an elk," I said, more forcefully than I intended. "It was walking upright, like a man, but bigger, much bigger." The laughter died down. They were all looking at me now with varying degrees of concern and skepticism. "You been drinking before you got here?" Steve asked, only half joking. "No," I said. "Look, I know what I saw. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. At least, not any animal I've ever seen." Mike got up and looked out the small window. "Can't see shit out there now. Too dark and foggy." He turned back to me with a smirk. Maybe it was the abominable snowman. They all laughed again, and I forced a smile, trying to shrug it off. But inside I was still shaking, because I absolutely knew, that what I had seen wasn't my imagination or a trick of the light or an elk or any other normal explanation. That night, I barely slept. Every sound from outside, the wind in the trees, branches creaking with snow, distant animal calls, had me wide awake, straining to listen. I kept thinking about those eyes looking at me, that deliberate way it had of turning to make sure I was watching. It knew I was there. It knew. The next morning, I convinced Paul to walk over to the hillside with me. The snow had continued overnight, laying down a fresh blanket that was about 3 inches deep. We trudged across the clearing, me scanning the tree line constantly, half expecting to see that figure emerge again. When we reached the approximate area where I'd seen it enter the forest, I started looking for tracks. But the fresh snow had covered everything. Paul watched me with growing impatience as I searched back and forth along the edge of the trees. "Dan, man, there's nothing here," he said finally. "Look, we've all had weird experiences in the woods. Your eyes can play tricks on you, especially at dusk. It was probably just a bear standing up to get a better look at you." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to have a rational explanation that would let me sleep at night. But I knew better. Bears don't walk on 2 legs for hundreds of yards, and they don't move like this thing did. Paul just shook his head and started walking back to camp. "Come on, Steve's making breakfast and we need to get moving if we're going to hunt today." I followed him reluctantly, glancing back over my shoulder multiple times. The forest seemed darker and more forbidding than it had the day before, like it was hiding secrets. I stayed with them that day, going through the motions of helping set up their hunting blinds, but my heart wasn't in it. Every sound in the woods made me jump. By afternoon, I'd made up an excuse about needing to get back for work the next day, packed up my stuff, and headed out, despite their protests. The ride back was a blur. All I could think about was what I'd seen. Over the years since then, I've read everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. The descriptions often match what I saw: the height, the build, the way it moved. Some accounts mention the same thing I experienced, where the creature seemed aware of being observed and would deliberately look at the witness. I've never gone back to that specific area. I've been camping and hiking plenty of times since then, but always with a low-grade anxiety humming in the background, always scanning the trees and hills, half afraid and half hoping to see it again. Because even after all these years, I need to know that I wasn't crazy, that what I saw was real. Sometimes in my dreams, I'm back on that cold road, and instead of just watching me, the thing starts walking toward me, covering that distance with those huge, efficient strides. I always wake up before it reaches me, my heart pounding, sheets soaked with sweat. I don't know what I saw that day in 1973. I don't know if it was what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch or something else entirely. But I know it was real, I know it was intelligent, and I know that it let me see it. Why? That's the question that keeps me up at night, even now. Why did it reveal itself to me? Was it just chance? Or was there a purpose behind it? And if there was a purpose, what was it? I don't expect I'll ever have answers, but I know what I saw, and it wasn't human. Story 7. I still get goosebumps thinking about that summer day in 1953. I was 8 years old, and time worked differently back then. Summers stretched forever, especially in Holden, where there wasn't much for a kid to do except explore the wilderness surrounding our little mining community. My dad worked for Howe Sound Mining Company, extracting copper from the mountains. Holden wasn't exactly a town, more like a company settlement tucked away in the North Cascades of Washington state. Everything revolved around the mine: the houses, the small store, the recreation hall. Beyond that was nothing but wilderness for miles and miles. It was late July or early August, hot as blazes. Me and Jimmy Porter were playing in this makeshift sandbox near Miners Creek, about a quarter-mile from the company houses. The adults had built it for us kids the previous summer, hauling in sand from who knows where. The creek was our favorite spot because it was cooler by the water and we could splash around when we got too hot. We'd been digging tunnels and building little dams for hours. Jimmy was busy creating some elaborate mine shaft, copying what our dads did, I suppose, while I was smashing my toy truck through a hill I'd made. I remember hearing the creek bubbling over the rocks. It was running lower than usual because of the summer heat, exposing more of the boulders that normally sat submerged. I looked up, mostly because my neck was getting stiff from staring down at the sand for so long. That's when I spotted it. Across the creek, maybe 50 yards upstream, was what I initially thought was a person wearing a dark fur coat. My first thought was literally, who wears a coat in this heat? It made no sense. The figure was moving deliberately, stepping from boulder to boulder along the creek, frequently looking down at the water's edge like it was searching for something. "Jimmy," I said, nudging him with my elbow, "look at that guy over there." Jimmy glanced up briefly, then went back to digging. "I don't see nobody." "There," I pointed, "by that big rock, the one shaped like a turtle." Jimmy squinted, then his eyes widened. "What's he wearing? Is that a bear?" "Bears don't walk like that," I said, though I'd never actually seen a bear in person. The figure continued moving downstream toward us, still focused on the creek bed. I could see now it wasn't a coat. The fur seemed to be part of whatever it was. The creature moved slowly but with purpose, occasionally stopping to bend down toward the water. It was completely covered in dark brown, almost black fur. And it was big, much taller than my dad, who was over 6 feet himself. "I'm getting my dad," I said, suddenly feeling uneasy. Jimmy didn't argue. I ran back to the settlement, heart pounding. My dad was outside our house, fixing a broken screen door. "Dad, Dad!" I shouted, out of breath. "There's something by the creek. It looks like a person, but it's all hairy." My dad gave me that look adults give kids when they think you're making things up. "Thomas, did you and Jimmy see another black bear? I told you they're nothing to worry about if you—" "It's not a bear," I insisted. "It walks like a person, on two legs. It's going rock to rock down the creek." Something in my voice must have convinced him because he put down his tools. "All right, show me." Dad called over to Mr. Porter and Mr. Hanson, who were nearby. We headed back toward the creek, picking up a couple more miners along the way. One of them, I think it was Mr. Gunderson, grabbed binoculars from his house. Jimmy was still at the sandbox, but he'd backed away from the creek, standing at the edge of the trees. He pointed upstream without saying anything. The creature was still there, now maybe 100 yards away, continuing its methodical journey downstream, boulder to boulder. Through the gaps in the trees, we could see it clearly in the midday sun. The adults fell silent. "What in God's name is that?" Mr. Porter finally whispered. My dad took the binoculars from Mr. Gunderson and focused them. "It's about 7 feet tall, I'd guess, walking upright." "Can't be a bear," Mr. Hanson said. "Bears don't walk like that, and they sure as hell don't step from boulder to boulder that way." "Could be a man in a costume," Mr. Porter suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Out here?" My dad shook his head. "We're the only settlement for 40 miles, and who would trek through this wilderness in a fur suit in August?" The creature had reached a bend in the creek west of the mine. On the far side was a massive scree field, a slope of loose rock that had fallen from the mountain above. It made that side nearly inaccessible. We never went over there because climbing that scree field was dangerous, with rocks that could slide out from under your feet at any moment. Mr. Gunderson took his turn with the binoculars. "It's got arms longer than a man's, and the face, I can't make it out properly, but it's not human." The men passed the binoculars around. I kept asking to see, but they ignored me, too focused on the creature. By now, a few more people had joined us, including Mrs. Gunderson and my mom, who had come looking for us. "What's going on?" my mom asked. "There's something across the creek," my dad answered, not taking his eyes off the creature. "Never seen anything like it." Through gaps in the conversation, I could hear the adults debating in hushed, tense voices. The face is flat, almost like a gorilla. "There aren't any gorillas in Washington, don't be ridiculous." "It's too tall to be a bear, even standing. The way it moves, so deliberate. What if it's one of those things the Indians talk about?" The creature had stopped at the water's edge and was bending down, using its long arms to reach into the creek. It plucked something out, a fish maybe, and straightened up. That's when it happened. The thing suddenly went still. It lifted its head and looked directly at our group. Even from that distance, I felt a chill run through me. I couldn't see its eyes clearly, but I knew it was staring right at us. For what felt like forever, nobody moved. Not us, not the creature. Then, with deliberate slowness, it turned away from the creek and began walking back upstream. But this was different from before. It wasn't stepping from boulder to boulder anymore. It was walking on the shore with a smooth gait that wasn't quite human. "Look at the arms," whispered Mr. Hanson. "They swing different." He was right. The creature's arms swung widely at its sides, almost reaching its knees. Its back was straighter than a human's, its head set forward on powerful shoulders. "Should we try to follow it?" Mr. Gunderson asked. My dad shook his head. "We'd have to cross the creek and climb that scree field. By the time we got across, it would be gone." We watched as the creature disappeared around the bend, heading deeper into the wilderness. The adults stood there for a long time after it vanished, still staring at the spot where we'd last seen it. The rest of that day was a blur of excitement and confusion. The men gathered at our house, discussing what they'd seen, drawing diagrams, arguing about details. Words I'd never heard before were thrown around. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Wildman. The natives up north have stories about them, Mr. Gunderson said. He'd worked in British Columbia before coming to Holden. They call them Sasquatch, supposed to be shy, stay away from people. This is different, my dad insisted. Whatever this was, it was real. No legend, no campfire story. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature turning to look at us. I kept imagining it coming to our house, peering in through my bedroom window with those eyes I couldn't quite see, but somehow knew were intelligent. The next morning, my dad and some of the other men went back to the creek. They crossed where it was shallow and tried to find tracks on the other side, but the rocky ground didn't hold footprints well. They found a few depressions in some sandy patches that my dad said were bigger than any human foot, but nothing conclusive. Life eventually returned to normal in Holden. Some people dismissed what we'd seen as a bear, despite all evidence to the contrary. Others believed it was a man playing a prank, though nobody could explain who would do such a thing or how they'd gotten there. The incident became something people talked about less and less as the weeks passed. But I never forgot. Sometimes at night, I'd hear sounds outside my window, branches breaking, rocks shifting, and I'd lie frozen in my bed, wondering if it had come back. I'd strain my ears, trying to hear if those sounds were random nature noises or something moving with purpose. My family left Holden 2 years later when the copper started running out and the company began laying people off. We moved to Spokane, where my dad found work in manufacturing. City life was a shock after years in the wilderness, but part of me was relieved to be away from those mountains and whatever lived in them. I'm 78 now, and I've never told this story publicly. For years, I convinced myself it was just a childhood imagination run wild, fueled by the reactions of the adults around me. But every time I see a documentary about Bigfoot, or read an article about unexplained creatures in the Pacific Northwest, I'm right back there at Miners Creek, watching that fur-covered figure stepping from boulder to boulder. What burns in my memory most isn't the creature itself, but the moment it noticed us. There was recognition in that moment, an awareness. It wasn't startled or frightened. It simply acknowledged our presence and decided to leave. That deliberateness has haunted me for 70 years. The North Cascades are different now. Holden was eventually converted into a Lutheran retreat center after the mine closed. Tourists hike where we once lived isolated lives. But those mountains still hold vast swaths of wilderness, places humans rarely tread. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, stepping from boulder to boulder along Miners Creek, looking down at the water's edge. And sometimes, on sleepless nights, I wonder if it remembers the day it looked up and saw us watching. I don't have proof. I don't have photos or plaster casts of footprints. All I have is the memory of what I saw that summer day in 1953. A memory that's remained vivid when so many others have faded. I know what I saw wasn't a man in a fur coat, and it wasn't a bear. Whatever it was, it didn't belong to the world I knew then, and it doesn't belong to the world I know now. But it was real as the creek, as real as the mountains, as real as the fear that kept me awake all those nights afterward. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see it turning to look at us before disappearing into the wilderness where no human was meant to follow. Story 8. It was November 9th, a Thursday. I'd been in Indianapolis for work. I fix industrial HVAC systems, and we had a 3-day job at a warehouse up there. Nothing special, just routine maintenance that had me driving back late. I was tired, but feeling good about heading home to Somerset. My girlfriend had texted saying she'd leave dinner in the fridge, which was all the motivation I needed to make the 3-hour drive without stopping much. The sun had set around 5:30, and by 7 o'clock it was completely dark. I know the exact time because I remember glancing at my truck's clock, calculating when I'd get home. I was on Highway 27, maybe 6 or 7 miles north of Burnside, in that stretch where the road winds through dense woods. Anyone who drives that route knows it, especially at night. The trees crowd right up to the shoulder, and the hills rise steep on both sides. Traffic was almost non-existent. I'd passed maybe 2 cars in the previous 15 minutes, and my high beams were cutting through the darkness ahead of me. I had the radio on low, some country station, nothing memorable, and I was going about 65, maybe a touch faster, when the road straightened out. That's when I noticed something moving down the hillside to my right, the west side of the highway. At first, I thought it was a deer. We get plenty around here, and hitting one can total your vehicle. But something about the movement caught my attention. It wasn't bounding like a deer. It wasn't lumbering like a bear either. It was running on 2 legs down a steep hill. I eased off the gas, thinking maybe it was a hiker or hunter, though what anyone would be doing out there at that hour, in that darkness, made no sense. Then my headlights caught it better, and I felt my stomach drop. This thing was massive. I'm not talking big guy massive, I'm talking impossible massive. I hit the brakes harder than I meant to, and my truck fishtailed a bit. The back end swung out, and for a split second, I was more worried about going into the ditch than whatever was coming down that hill. When I got the truck under control, I'd slowed to maybe 10 miles an hour. That's when it stepped onto the road, right in front of me, maybe 20 feet ahead. I slammed the brakes and came to a complete stop. My hands were locked on the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The thing just stood there, in my headlights, staring directly at me. My window was up, but the passenger window was cracked a few inches because I'd been feeling a little drowsy and wanted fresh air. Through that gap I could hear it breathing, heavy, deep breaths, not panicked like it had been surprised by my truck, steady, deliberate. It was at least 8 feet tall. That's not an exaggeration. I'm 6 foot even, and this thing would have towered over me. It was covered in dark brown hair, not fur like a bear, but more like hair, shaggy and thick. In my headlights, it had an almost reddish tint to it in places, especially around the shoulders. The shoulders, Jesus, they must have been 3 feet across. The proportions were all wrong for a human, too broad and powerful. Its arms hung down past its waist, ending in hands that looked like they could wrap completely around a basketball, or my skull. But the eyes are what I'll never forget. They weren't reflecting my headlights like an animal's eyes would. They were glowing on their own, a deep, burning red. Not bright like taillights, but smoldering like coals in a dying fire. They were set deep under a prominent brow ridge, giving it this intense, intelligent look that made my blood run cold. We just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think about reaching for my phone to take a picture. All I could do was sit there, engine idling, hands frozen on the wheel. Then it growled. I've heard bears growl. I've heard mountain lions. Hell, I've heard just about every sound an animal in Kentucky can make. This wasn't like any of them. It was deeper, more guttural, something you felt in your chest more than heard. It vibrated through the truck, through my body. It wasn't just threatening. It felt ancient somehow, like something that didn't belong in our world. After the growl, it just kept staring. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to lay on the horn, but a much bigger part was afraid of provoking it. My truck suddenly felt paper thin, like no protection at all. Then, with a deliberate slowness that was somehow more terrifying than if it had charged, the creature turned sideways. I could see its full profile then, the way its chest jutted forward, the slight hunch to its shoulders, the massive thighs easily twice the size of mine. It took a step toward the left side of the road, the north side, where the hill climbed up again. Its gait was smooth, nothing like the awkward movement you'd expect from a man in a suit or someone on stilts. Each footfall was deliberate, powerful. It didn't look back at me. 4 or 5 massive strides, and it reached the tree line on the other side of the road. I expected to hear it crashing through the underbrush. Something that size should make noise, but there was nothing. Absolute silence as it disappeared into the darkness. I sat there for about a minute, maybe more. My hands were trembling so badly I couldn't have driven anyway. The only sound was my breathing and the idle of the engine. Eventually, I managed to put the truck in gear and move forward, driving slowly past the spot where it had stood. There was nothing on the road, no footprints, no sign it had been there at all. I kept driving south, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the trees on both sides of the highway. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every tree trunk looked like it might be standing upright, watching me. I didn't speed, though every instinct told me to floor it. Something about going faster seemed like it would attract attention, like running from a predator. When I hit Burnside, I pulled into the first gas station I saw. I needed to be around people, lights, something normal. It was one of those convenience stores with the attached gas station. I can't even remember which brand. I went inside, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. The cashier was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. I must have looked rough because she asked if I was okay the moment I walked in. I bought a coffee I didn't need, mostly for an excuse to talk to someone. When I put it on the counter, my hand was still shaking. "You all right, honey?" she asked again. "You look like you've had a scare." I hesitated before saying anything. Everyone knows you don't talk about seeing things like this unless you want people thinking you're crazy or drunk. But I needed to tell someone. "I just saw something on the highway," I said. "Just north of here, maybe 6 miles up." "What kind of something?" She wasn't dismissive, just curious. "This is going to sound crazy," I said, but it was like, I don't know, like a Sasquatch or something. Huge, walking on 2 legs. I expected her to laugh. She didn't. She just nodded slowly, like I'd told her I'd seen a deer or a turkey. "You're not the first," she said, pushing my coffee across the counter. "Not by a long shot." I must have looked surprised because she continued. "We get folks in here pretty regular who've seen things in those woods, especially up toward the Daniel Boone forest. My brother-in-law's a game warden, says they get reports all the time, but they don't put them in the official records." "So you believe me?" I asked. "Honey, I've lived here 40 years. There's things in those hills that don't have names. My granddaddy used to call them the old people of the forest, said they were here long before us and will be here long after." She wouldn't say much more than that, just that I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't the first to come in looking shaken after driving that stretch at night. I finished my coffee, thanked her, and got back on the road. I drove the rest of the way home with all the windows up and the doors locked, constantly checking my mirrors. When I got home, I didn't tell my girlfriend what happened. I just said I was tired from the drive. I didn't tell anyone for weeks, actually. Who would believe it? A giant, hairy man thing with glowing red eyes standing in the middle of Highway 27. I'd sound like I'd been drinking or hallucinating from exhaustion. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't a guy in a costume. The way it moved, the proportions, the eyes. No costume has eyes like that. And that growl, I can still feel it in my chest when I think about it. I've been reading up on Sasquatch sightings since then. Turns out Kentucky has hundreds of reports, especially in the eastern part of the state. Daniel Boone National Forest has a bunch of them going back decades. People see the same thing I saw. The height, the red eyes, the way they move silently through thick forest. What gets me is that I'm an ordinary guy. I don't believe in ghosts or aliens or any of that stuff. I'm as skeptical as they come. But I know what I saw. There's no explaining it away. I've avoided that stretch of highway at night since then. I'll take the long way around if I have to drive after dark. It adds 40 minutes to my trip, but that's a price I'm willing to pay. Sometimes I think about going back during the day with my buddy who hunts. He's got trail cameras we could set up. But then I remember those eyes, that growl, the way it just vanished into the forest without a sound. and I reconsider. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just an animal. It was looking at me with intelligence. It was deciding whether to let me go. I don't want to push my luck by going looking for it. So that's my story. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but I know what I saw, and I know I'm not alone. There are things in those Kentucky hills that don't make it into biology textbooks or nature documentaries. Things that stay hidden most of the time, but sometimes, when the conditions are just right or just wrong, they show themselves. And when they do, all you can hope is that they decide to let you drive away with nothing but a story no one will believe. I still drive that route during daylight hours. I have to for work sometimes. And every time I pass that spot, I scan the hillside looking for movement. Nothing so far. But sometimes, just for a second, I swear I can feel eyes watching from the tree line. And on windy days, when the trees sway and the leaves rustle, it almost sounds like breathing, heavy, deliberate breathing, the kind that makes your chest vibrate just hearing it. Story 9. I still get a knot in my stomach every time someone invites me camping. It's been over a year now, but what happened that night near Buckhorn Lake in June of 2022 is burned into my brain. I've never posted about this before, but I need to get it out. Maybe someone else has seen something similar out there. My cousins Jake, 15, and Trevor, 17, had been begging me to take them camping for months. Their parents are super protective, but they trusted me since I'm older, 24, and had plenty of camping experience. I'd been going to Buckhorn Lake since I was a kid myself. My dad used to take me fishing there all the time before he passed. We chose this secluded spot about half a mile from the main camping area. It's this little clearing near a creek that feeds into the lake, surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides. Perfect place to stargaze, which was what the boys really wanted to do. It was mid-June, warm enough that we decided to just use this mesh tent I had. Basically just a frame with bug netting and a rainfly we didn't even put on since the forecast was clear. We wanted to see the stars while we slept. We spent the day hiking, fishing, and just hanging out. Nothing weird about the day at all. We cooked some burgers on a small portable grill, told some stupid ghost stories, ironic now, and eventually crawled into our sleeping bags around 11. I remember checking the time on my phone and seeing I only had 1 bar of service. The boys fell asleep pretty quick, but I stayed up a bit longer, just enjoying the sounds of the forest and watching the stars through the mesh ceiling. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I remember is Jake's scream waking me up. Not like a startled yelp, a full-on terrified scream that made my heart nearly stop. I shot up thinking maybe a bear had wandered into our camp or something. What? What is it? I whispered urgently, still half asleep. Jake was sitting up in his sleeping bag, pointing toward the creek side of our tent, his hand shaking so bad I could see it even in the darkness. Trevor was already awake too, frozen stiff next to me. There's something out there, Jake whispered, his voice cracking. I thought it was a raccoon or something, but it's not. That's when I saw it, and every hair on my body stood straight up. About 20 feet from our tent, partially illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the trees, was this massive figure. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but no bear moves like that. This thing was walking upright, completely bipedal, with a stride that was eerily human-like, but not quite. It was huge, easily between 6 and 7 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong for a person, though. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, maybe twice the width of mine, and I'm not a small guy. Its arms hung down much lower than a human's would, almost to its knees. The whole body was covered in this dark, shaggy hair or fur. In the moonlight, it looked dark brown, almost black in places, and matted like it hadn't been groomed in years. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was the smell that hit us. It came in waves as the thing moved, this putrid stench that I can only describe as a mix of rotten eggs, decaying meat and garbage that's been baking in the sun for days. It was so strong, I had to fight the urge to gag. Trevor actually did gag, and I had to clap my hand over his mouth to keep him quiet. The most unsettling thing, though, the woods had gone completely silent. No crickets, no frogs from the creek, no owls, nothing. Just dead silence except for our breathing and this thing's footsteps. Each step it took was deliberate, heavy enough that I could feel slight vibrations through the ground. We all three just sat there, paralyzed with fear, watching as it moved slowly across our campsite. It didn't seem aggressive or even particularly interested in us. It was just passing through. But there was a deliberateness to its movements that suggested intelligence. This wasn't just an animal wandering randomly. When it reached the other side of our clearing, right before it would disappear into the thick forest, it stopped. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was going to turn around and come toward us. Instead, it just rotated its upper body, like its torso turned while its legs stayed facing the woods. Then it looked back at us. I couldn't make out its face clearly in the darkness, but I could see the silhouette of a somewhat pointed head, not rounded like ours. And I swear I could feel it studying us. 10 seconds. That's how long it stood there, just staring. I counted each second in my head, trying desperately to stay calm. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, all the way to 10. Then, without any sound or warning, it simply turned back and melted into the tree line. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. None of us moved for what felt like forever. Jake was shaking uncontrollably, and Trevor had tears silently streaming down his face. I realized I'd been holding my breath and finally let it out in a shuddering gasp. "What the fuck was that?" Trevor finally whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I knew what it looked like, what it had to be, but my rational mind was fighting against accepting it. "Maybe it was a bear," I said, not believing my own words. "That wasn't a fucking bear, Marcus," Jake hissed. "You saw it walking, on 2 legs, the whole time." He was right. There was no explaining this away. We'd just seen a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it, the thing that's supposed to be a myth. Gradually, over the next half hour, the forest sounds started to come back. First a single cricket, then a few frogs, then eventually the normal nighttime chorus returned. But none of us even thought about trying to go back to sleep. We sat huddled together in that mesh tent, too scared to even whisper much, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. I kept checking my phone, 2:15, 2:45, 3:20. The minutes crawled by. I tried turning on my flashlight a couple times to scan the woods, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness, and honestly, I was terrified of attracting that thing back to us. Around 4 in the morning, the first hint of pre-dawn light started to appear. By 4:30, it was light enough to see the outlines of the trees around us. That's when Jake said, "Look," pointing to the ground where the creature had walked. In the soft earth near the creek, there were footprints, massive footprints. They had to be at least 15 inches long and incredibly wide. They weren't perfect impressions, just depressions in the morning dew-covered ground, but they were unmistakably footprints. And they followed the exact path we'd watched the creature take. That was enough for us. Without even discussing it, we started packing up. We were normally careful about leaving no trace when camping, but that morning we just shoved everything haphazardly into our backpacks. The tent came down in record time. We didn't even eat breakfast or make coffee. Our only thought was getting the hell out of there. By 5:15, we were already hiking back toward where I'd parked my truck. Normally, the half-mile hike was pleasant, but that morning it was terrifying. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every sound made us freeze. We stuck close together, constantly looking over our shoulders. When we finally reached my truck, Trevor started crying again, this time from relief. We threw our gear in the back and got the hell out of there. Nobody spoke for the first 20 minutes of the drive. I was white-knuckling the steering wheel so hard my hands cramped up. Finally, as we got back to more populated areas, Jake broke the silence. "We need to report this, right? Tell someone?" I thought about it. Who would we even tell? The park rangers, the police. They'd think we were crazy or playing a prank. "Who's going to believe 3 guys saying they saw Bigfoot?" I replied. "But those footprints," Trevor started. "We didn't take pictures," I cut him off. "We didn't get evidence. It would just be our word." The truth was, I was embarrassed. Not just about possibly being laughed at, but deeper than that. I felt like I'd failed at protecting my cousins. I'd taken them into those woods, promising their parents I'd keep them safe, and instead we'd encountered something impossible, something that had left us all traumatized. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. When I dropped the boys off at home, we made a pact not to tell anyone. "They'll just think we're making it up," I said, and they reluctantly agreed. 2 weeks later, though, I couldn't help myself. I drove back to Buckhorn Lake alone. Not to the same spot, I couldn't bring myself to go there again, but to a local bait shop near the lake entrance. I casually asked the old guy working there if people ever reported seeing anything strange in those woods. The look he gave me made my stomach drop, not surprise or confusion, recognition. "You saw something, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I hesitated, then nodded. He sighed and leaned on the counter. "Folks around here don't talk about it much with outsiders, but there's been stories about the buckhorn walker for generations. My granddaddy used to tell me about it. Big hairy thing that comes down from the hills sometimes, mostly keeps to itself. Has anyone ever been hurt by it?" I asked. "Not that I know of," he said, shaking his head. "But people who see it tend not to go looking for a second encounter." He was right about that. I haven't been camping since. Not at Buckhorn, not anywhere. My cousins don't bring it up, but sometimes I'll catch Jake looking anxiously at the trees when we're outdoors, even in broad daylight in town. The worst thing is the dreams. I keep having this recurring nightmare where I'm back in that mesh tent, and instead of walking past us, the creature stops, turns around, and comes straight for us. I always wake up right as it reaches for the tent, and the strangest part is I wake up smelling that same putrid odor, so vivid it makes me check the house to make sure nothing's there. I know what we saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man in a costume, and it wasn't mass hallucination. There's something out there in those Kentucky woods that shouldn't exist, but it does. I've looked online at other Sasquatch sightings since then, and so many details match. The height, the walk, the overwhelming stench, the way the forest goes quiet. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, walking through campsites at night, watching people through mesh tents. And sometimes, when I catch a certain smell, like garbage on a hot day or something rotting, I freeze up completely, transported back to that night when the world as I understood it changed forever. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I probably wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what the 3 of us experienced that night was real, and I know I'm never going back to those woods again. Story 10. I've never told anyone about this. Not my wife, not my hunting buddies, not even my dad, who taught me everything I know about the woods. I've kept this bottled up for months now, and it's eating me alive. I need to get this off my chest, even if you all think I'm crazy or lying. I know what I saw. It happened on September 21st of last year, which was a Thursday. I remember because I had taken Friday off work to get a long weekend for bow season. I'm a plumber by trade, but hunting is my real passion. Been doing it since I was 12, and I know the forests around Oak Ridge, Oregon, like the back of my hand. Or at least, I thought I did. That evening, I was out scouting a new spot for the next morning's hunt. The area was about 15 miles outside of town on public forest land, a spot where I'd seen decent buck sign in previous years, but had never set up. The sun was just starting to set, and I was walking back along this old gravel logging road to where I'd parked my truck about a mile away. I wasn't carrying my bow, Just had my backpack with my rangefinder, some water, and my trail camera that I'd just set up. The temperature was dropping fast as the sun went down, and I was thinking about that lasagna my wife had promised would be waiting for me when I got home. I remember feeling really good, really confident about the next day. I'd found a perfect funnel point where two game trails intersected near a small creek with fresh rubs and droppings all around. Classic ambush spot. I was maybe half a mile from my truck when it happened. The forest had gotten really quiet. You know how sometimes there's this kind of stillness that falls over everything? No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling around. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It was getting dark, temperatures were dropping, makes sense things would quiet down. But looking back, that was the first warning. I was walking at a good clip, eager to get back to my truck before it got completely dark. I had a headlamp in my pack, but I hadn't pulled it out yet, since there was still enough light to see the gravel road. The sun had just dipped below the tree line, casting this orange-pink glow through the forest. Beautiful evening, really. Then I heard it. A sharp crack of a branch breaking somewhere in the thick brush to my left. It was loud, not like a squirrel or even a deer. This sounded like someone had snapped a baseball bat in half. I stopped and instinctively reached for my sidearm, which I always carry when I'm in the woods. I pulled it out and just stood there listening. Nothing. Just complete silence for maybe 10 seconds. I took a deep breath and told myself it was probably just a deer, maybe even an elk, though I hadn't seen elk sign in this particular area. I holstered my gun and started walking again, but faster this time. That's when it happened. About 15 feet in front of me, something massive burst out from the trees on my left and tore across the gravel road. I froze mid-step. My brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. It was huge, way bigger than a bear, moving in this weird, hunched-over run. It crossed the entire width of the road in maybe 2 strides and disappeared into the thick brush on the other side. The whole thing lasted maybe 3 seconds, but every detail burned into my memory like a brand. This thing was covered in thick black hair, shaggy and uneven, maybe 4 inches long in some places. But it wasn't smooth or well kept like a bear's fur. It was matted and tangled with twigs, leaves, and God knows what else caught in it. The hair moved as it ran, swinging with each step like it was heavy. Its proportions were all wrong for any animal I've ever seen or hunted. Imagine a gorilla, but massively oversized. If it had stood upright, it would have been at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The shoulders were incredibly wide, wider than any human bodybuilder I've ever seen, with this massive barrel-shaped chest. But the most unsettling thing was its arms. They hung down almost to its knees, swinging as it moved in this fluid but powerful way. Even through all that hair, I could see muscles shifting and rippling under its coat. Not like the bulging, defined muscles you'd see on a bodybuilder, but this raw, functional power, like watching the engine of a truck working under a hood. Each movement revealed another group of muscles engaging to propel it forward with incredible speed. The way it moved was wrong. It wasn't running on all fours like a bear, but it wasn't standing fully upright either. It was hunched forward, using those impossibly long arms, almost like another set of legs, touching the ground occasionally for balance as it ran. And it was fast, impossibly fast for something that size. It cleared the 20-foot width of the road in what felt like a single heartbeat. But it was the head that haunts me the most. I only caught a glimpse of its profile as it passed, but what I saw, Jesus. Its head wasn't like a bear at all. It was more like a gorilla's, but different. It had this low, sloping forehead that seemed to blend right into a prominent brow ridge. The jaw was wide and powerful looking. The nose was flat against its face, almost like it had been squashed inward. The hair was thinner on its face, revealing grayish, leathery skin underneath. And the eyes. God, the eyes. They caught the dying sunlight for just an instant as it turned its head slightly during its dash across the road. They glowed with this reddish-orange color that didn't look natural, like some kind of reflection, but more intense, Those eyes didn't look animal. They looked aware, intelligent. And that's what scares me the most when I think back on it. As it moved past me, each footfall made this deep thudding sound I could feel in my chest. It was grunting and making these low, moaning sounds, not like any animal call I've heard before. There was this rhythm to it, with each step it took. And behind it, I could hear branches and underbrush snapping and being pushed aside by its massive body. Then the smell hit me. I've field-dressed hundreds of deer. I've smelled bear scat and fox musk and every other wild animal stink you can imagine. Nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to what washed over me as this thing passed by. It was like rotting meat that had been left in the sun for days, mixed with the wet dog smell of a soaked coyote, but amplified 100 times. The stench was so powerful it made my eyes water instantly. I actually gagged and had to cover my mouth and nose with my sleeve. As it disappeared into the brush, I noticed something else that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. The hair around its lower back and legs was especially matted and discolored, darker in some spots. It looked like dried feces caked into the fur, not like it had rolled in something, but like its own waste had dried there over time, like it didn't clean itself. There was something deeply unsettling about that detail, something that made it seem less animal and more, I don't know, primal, feral. After it vanished into the trees on the other side of the road, I could hear it crashing through the underbrush for several more seconds. The sound gradually faded as it moved away, but I swear I could feel the ground vibrating from its footfalls even after I couldn't hear it anymore. I don't know how long I stood there. My legs were locked in place and I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe right. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. My mouth had gone completely dry. I faced down black bears at close range. I've had a cougar stalk me once. Never felt fear like this. Finally, something in my brain clicked and survival instinct took over. I turned and ran back the way I came. I didn't care how much noise I made, I just ran, full sprint, back to my truck. I remember fumbling with my keys, dropping them once before I finally got the door unlocked. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I started the engine, I caught movement in my rearview mirror. Just a shadow crossing between trees, maybe 50 yards back down the road. I slammed the truck into drive and peeled out, spraying gravel everywhere. I drove way too fast down that logging road, bouncing over potholes and nearly losing control on the curves. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement, and even then, I drove well over the speed limit all the way home. When I got home, my wife asked why I was so pale and sweaty. I told her I'd almost hit a deer on the drive back, and it had scared me. I couldn't eat the lasagna. I couldn't eat anything. I took a shower that lasted almost an hour, trying to wash away the memory of that smell. I didn't go hunting the next day, or the whole season, actually. I told everyone I pulled my back at work. The truth is, I couldn't make myself go back into those woods. My trail camera is still out there, attached to a tree about a quarter mile from where I saw that thing. I'm never going back for it. It's been months now, and I still wake up in cold sweats from dreams where I'm being chased by something I can hear but can't see. Something that grunts and moans with each footfall. Something that smells like death. I've spent hours online researching, trying to make sense of what I saw. The closest thing I can find is what people call Sasquatch or Bigfoot. But those always seemed like jokes to me before. Campfire stories, not something real. I've been hunting these woods for over 20 years and never saw anything, never even heard stories from other hunters in the area. So why now? Why me? I keep telling myself it was a bear. Maybe a bear with mange or some kind of deformity. But bears don't run like that. They don't have those proportions. They don't have eyes that look at you with intelligence. I haven't told anyone about this until now, because I know how it sounds. I'm a practical guy. I fix pipes and hunt deer and pay my taxes. I'm not some conspiracy nut, but I know what I saw. It was 15 feet away from me in clear visibility, even with the fading light, close enough that if I'd reached out, I could have touched it as it passed. Close enough that I could see individual twigs tangled in its fur. I still drive past that forest on my way to work every day, and every time I look into those trees and wonder if it's in there, watching the road, watching me. Sometimes I think about going back with a group of guys, maybe trying to find tracks or evidence, but then I remember those eyes, that awareness, and I keep driving. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't want to know. All I know is that my understanding of what exists in this world fundamentally changed in those few seconds. And I can never go back to not knowing. I still haven't been hunting since then. My bow is collecting dust in the garage, and my hunting buddies have stopped asking me to join them. My wife thinks I've lost interest, but the truth is, I've lost my nerve. The forest doesn't feel like home anymore. It feels like somewhere I don't belong. I don't know why I'm finally sharing this now. Maybe I'm hoping someone else has seen it. Maybe I just need to tell someone before it drives me crazy. But I swear on everything I have, on my life, that what I've told you is exactly what happened on that gravel road outside Oak Ridge last September, and God help me, I hope I never see it again. Story 11. I still don't know if I'm doing the right thing by sharing this. It's been almost a year, and I haven't told many people because, well, who the hell would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest, and at least here I might find someone who's gone through something similar. Last summer, July 14th, 2022 to be exact, I had an experience that completely changed how I view the wilderness. I've been fishing the streams and rivers around Oregon my whole life. My dad taught me when I was 6, and it's always been my escape. When work gets stressful or life becomes too much, I grab my gear and head out. Never had a problem until that day. I live about 40 minutes from Kletskini, and there's some decent fishing spots in the forests out there that most tourists don't know about. I had the day off and decided to try a creek I'd heard about from another fisherman at the bait shop. He said it was a bit off the beaten path, but worth it. Supposedly had some nice cutthroat trout that haven't been fished out yet. I parked my truck at this small pull-off about a quarter mile from the main forest road. It was a beautiful morning, around 7 a.m., and the air had that perfect summer crispness before the heat kicks in. I grabbed my tackle box, rod, and a small backpack with water, a sandwich, and some trail mix. Standard stuff. The trail started off normal enough, a bit overgrown but clearly marked. After about 20 minutes of walking, I came to a fork that wasn't on the crude map the guy at the shop had drawn for me. I stood there for a minute, trying to figure out which way to go. The left path looked more traveled, but something pulled me toward the right one. I can't explain why I chose it. Just a gut feeling that there might be better fishing spots that way. God, I wish I'd listened to my second thoughts. This new path quickly became narrower, with branches reaching out from both sides. The forest was getting denser, but I kept going, figuring the creek couldn't be much further. I'd gone maybe a mile from my truck when things started feeling off. You know how forests are usually full of sounds? Birds chirping, squirrels rustling through leaves, insects buzzing. There's always background noise, but suddenly everything went silent. And I mean completely silent, like someone had hit a mute button on the whole forest. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe a hawk was nearby and the small critters were hiding. But then I noticed how the air felt different too. Heavy, pressing down on me. It was like walking through invisible syrup, each step requiring just a bit more effort than it should. I stopped and took a drink from my water bottle, trying to shake off the weird feeling. That's when I first noticed the smell. Jesus Christ, that smell. I've smelled dead animals in the woods before. I've been downwind of skunks. I've even had the misfortune of finding a deer carcass that had been rotting for days in summer heat. But this was different. Worse than all of those combined. It hit me like a physical wall, this overwhelming stench that was part rotting meat, part wet dog that had rolled in garbage, and something else I can't even describe. My eyes started watering immediately, and my stomach lurched so hard I thought I might throw up right there. I pulled my t-shirt up over my nose, but it didn't help much. I remember thinking maybe there was a dead animal nearby, but this smell was too intense, too widespread for that. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I was about to turn around and head back when something made me look ahead through the trees. About 30 yards away, partially hidden in shadows, was a shape. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear standing on its hind legs, maybe? But no, this was taller, much taller, and standing completely upright in a way that was unmistakably, well, not like any animal I've ever seen. It was massive, I'd guess 7 to 8 feet tall at least, with incredibly broad shoulders. The thing was covered in what looked like dark black or deep brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like long hair that hung from its arms and shoulders. I couldn't make out its face clearly through the trees and shadows, but I could feel it watching me. I don't mean that figuratively. I literally felt its gaze on me like a physical weight. For a few seconds, I stood frozen. My brain kept cycling through explanations. A bear, a person in a costume, a trick of the light. But I knew deep down it wasn't any of those things. This was something else entirely. Then it made a sound that I still hear in my nightmares. This deep, rumbling growl that started low and gradually built in intensity. It wasn't like a dog or wolf or bear. It was deeper, more resonant. I could feel it in my chest cavity, like when you stand too close to a big speaker at a concert. It vibrated through me. My instincts finally kicked in, and I took a careful step backward, trying not to make any sudden movements. That's when the strangest thing happened. The creature mirrored my movement exactly. I took one step back. It took one step forward. I stopped. It stopped. I shifted my weight to my right foot. It seemed to do the same. It was studying me, mimicking me in a way that felt deliberate and intelligent. This wasn't some dumb animal. Whatever this thing was, it was thinking, analyzing, deciding. I took another slow step back, and again it matched me. Each step I took, I could hear it moving through the underbrush. The sound of branches snapping under its weight, small trees creaking as it brushed past them. The noise seemed deliberately heavy, like it wanted me to know exactly where it was and how big it was. My fishing rod suddenly felt ridiculous in my hand. This flimsy piece of carbon fiber that I'd somehow thought important enough to bring into these woods. What was I going to do, cast a line at this thing? I had a small pocket knife in my backpack, but that seemed just as useless against something this size. I kept backing up, trying to keep my eyes on the shape while also watching my footing so I wouldn't trip. The thing kept pace perfectly, always maintaining that 30-yard distance. Not rushing me, not retreating, just following. Occasionally, it would let out another one of those bone-chilling growls, almost like a reminder that it was still there, still watching. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a couple of minutes, I reached a slight bend in the trail. I wondered if I should try to run, but everything I'd ever heard about encounters with wild animals told me not to. Running triggers chasing, and I had absolutely zero doubt that this thing could outrun me without breaking a sweat, so I kept up this slow, careful retreat. Step back, pause, step back, pause, always keeping my front toward the creature, never turning my back, and it kept up its mimicry, this bizarre dance of intimidation or curiosity or whatever the hell it was doing. As I rounded the bend in the trail, I briefly lost sight of it. My heart nearly stopped. Somehow, not seeing it was worse than seeing it. I could still smell that horrific stench, still hear its movements, but I couldn't spot it through the trees anymore. I picked up my pace slightly, still walking backward, straining my eyes to catch any movement. Then I heard a different sound, branches breaking off to my right, not on the trail. It was paralleling me now, moving through the forest alongside the path instead of directly on it. I caught glimpses of dark movement between trees, just enough to confirm it was still there, still following. The realization hit me. It knew these woods better than I did. Of course it did. This was its territory, and it was herding me out of it. I don't know how long this went on. Time gets weird when you're terrified. But eventually, I recognized some landmarks that told me I was getting closer to the fork in the trail. The creature was still pacing me through the woods, sometimes letting out that growl, sometimes making no sound at all for long stretches, which was almost worse. When I finally reached the fork, I saw no sign of it for a moment. The silence stretched out, and I wondered if maybe it had given up, decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Then I heard a loud crack, like a baseball bat hitting a tree trunk, from somewhere deep in the forest to my right. Then another crack, closer this time. It wasn't growling anymore. It was breaking things, snapping branches, maybe even small trees, with what sounded like absolutely minimal effort. I abandoned all pretense of staying calm and started walking faster, no longer backward but forward, occasionally throwing glances over my shoulder. The cracking sounds continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always following. I tripped twice in my haste, skinning my palm on the second fall. I barely felt it. All I could focus on was getting back to my truck. The main trail seemed 10 times longer than it had on the way in, every bend and turn unfamiliar, even though I'd just walked it hours before. The braking sounds kept pace with me the entire way, sometimes so close I was sure the thing was about to step onto the trail right behind me, other times fading just enough to make me hope it was giving up, but it never did. It followed me all the way back to the trailhead. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I nearly cried with relief. I half walked, half ran the last 50 yards, fumbling for my keys as I went. I could still hear it in the woods behind me, still breaking things, still letting me know it was there. The smell had faded somewhat, but not completely, like it was hanging back just inside the tree line, watching me flee. I got to my truck, yanked the door open and threw myself inside, dropping my fishing gear on the passenger seat. I locked the doors immediately and sat there for a moment, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't get the key in the ignition. I was breathing in ragged gasps, my shirt soaked with sweat. Through my rearview mirror, I stared at the forest edge. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, just at the edge of the trees, something shifted in the shadows. Just a slight movement, but enough for me to know it was standing there, watching my truck. I couldn't see it clearly, just that same dark silhouette partially hidden by foliage. But I knew it was looking right at me. I finally got the key in and started the engine. As I pulled away, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see it burst out of the forest and come after my vehicle. But it didn't. It just stood there at the edge of the woods until I turned onto the main road, and it disappeared from view. The whole drive home, I kept the windows up despite the summer heat, kept checking my mirrors at every turn. I didn't feel safe until I was back in town, surrounded by buildings and people and normalcy. I haven't been back to those woods since, haven't even driven past that particular turnoff. My fishing buddies ask why I won't go there anymore, and I make up excuses. Too many mosquitoes, water too low for good fishing, whatever. I haven't told any of them what happened. How could I? Hey guys, I met Bigfoot and it followed me through the woods making scary noises. Yeah, right. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, I know what I smelled. That thing was real, and it was intelligent, and it was letting me leave its territory instead of doing what it could have done to me if it wanted. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, still walking those woods, still protecting its space from intruders like me. I wonder if anyone else has encountered it and kept quiet like I have. I wonder if I'll ever get the nerve to go back, to try to see it again, maybe with a camera this time. But then I remember that growl, that smell, those sounds of trees breaking like twigs, and I know the answer. Some parts of the wilderness aren't meant for us. Some territories have belonged to others long before we started drawing maps and making trails. That thing was telling me I didn't belong there, and I got the message loud and clear. I still go fishing, just not there. Never there again. Story 12. I've been an avid backpacker for over 15 years, hiking some of the most remote wilderness areas across North America. I've had my share of wildlife encounters: bears in Glacier National Park, a mountain lion in the Sierras, even a wolverine in the North Cascades. But nothing prepared me for what happened last September in British Columbia. My hiking buddy Marco and I had been planning this particular trip for months. We're both experienced in off-trail navigation and backcountry survival, so we decided to explore a remote section of the Purcell Wilderness Conservancy. It looked perfect on the maps: pristine alpine basins, challenging ridgelines, and virtually no human presence. The area had no official trails, which was exactly the kind of wilderness experience we were after. We parked at a small trailhead on September 8th, checked our gear one last time, and headed in. The weather was perfect: crisp fall air, clear skies, with just enough chill to keep the bugs down. The first several miles followed an old logging road before we needed to veer off into pure wilderness. We were giddy with excitement as we left the faint path and started climbing toward our first campsite. The initial day went smoothly. We covered about 11 miles, gained significant elevation, and found a perfect little spot near a stream to set up camp. I remember feeling so at peace as we cooked dinner that first night, watching the alpenglow on distant peaks. We hung our food in a bear canister about 60 yards from camp, secured it properly, and turned in early. The trouble started the next morning. Our bear canister had been moved, not just knocked over, but dragged 20 to 30 feet from where we'd placed it. The weird part? It showed no damage, no teeth marks, nothing, and there were no visible prints around it, which made no sense. Bears leave tracks. So do moose, elk, and anything else big enough to move a loaded canister. "What do you think did this?" Marco asked, looking around nervously. I shrugged it off. "Probably a bear that was careful where it stepped. Or maybe we didn't secure it as well as we thought." We packed up and continued our journey. The day's hiking was tough but incredible. We scrambled up scree fields, traversed alpine meadows dotted with late-season wildflowers, and finally made camp in a small clearing surrounded by stunted subalpine firs. We were now deep in the backcountry, at least 15 miles from the nearest trail. That evening, we built a small fire and sat talking about routes for the next day. Around 11:30, I noticed Marco had stopped mid-sentence and was staring into the darkness beyond our fire. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first, I heard nothing over the crackling fire. Then it registered. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling our clearing just beyond the firelight. Not the quick patter of a deer or the heavy shuffle of a bear. These were bipedal steps, methodical and paced, like someone trying to move quietly but not quite managing it. "Hello?" I called out, thinking it might be another hiker, though we hadn't seen anyone for days and were miles from any trail. No response, just more footsteps, now moving to another position around our camp. I grabbed my high-powered flashlight and swept the trees in the direction of the sound. That's when I saw it. Eye shine about 15 meters away, dull gold and unblinking. As I held the beam steady, something stood up from what appeared to be a crouched position. My first thought wasn't Bigfoot or anything supernatural. I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs. But as more of its form became visible, I knew this was something else entirely. This wasn't the bulky, ape-like creature from Patterson-Gimlin footage or countless documentaries. What stood watching us had proportions all wrong for any animal I know. Its limbs were elongated, especially the forearms, which hung low at its sides. They didn't swing when it moved, just hung there, fingers curled slightly. Its chest was narrow rather than barrel-shaped, with shoulders that sloped steeply downward. It had virtually no neck, The head just seemed to project forward slightly from the torso. But the face, God, the face is what still haunts me. Not human-like at all, but not quite animal either. It had a mouth that was just a thin slit below what looked like a flat nasal ridge. Its eyes were set wide apart on its face, unblinking in my flashlight beam, reflecting that dull gold shine. What hit me hardest was the skin. Where the patchy, wiry hair didn't cover, its skin was a pale, grayish color, almost ashy, like something that never sees sunlight. We both froze. It stood motionless for several seconds, just staring. Then it simply stepped backward into the trees and disappeared. "What the fuck was that?" Marco hissed, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I admitted. "But let's get in the tent. Now." We quickly doused the fire and retreated to our tent, though neither of us slept much. We kept our knives and bear spray close. Throughout the night we heard more footsteps, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always circling. Morning came without further incident. We debated turning back, but decided to continue as planned, though now we were both on edge. We agreed to make our next camp early and secure everything well before dark. The third day, we hiked in tense silence, constantly scanning our surroundings. Several times I felt watched, but saw nothing. We found a defensible spot on higher ground with good visibility for our next camp, setting up with plenty of daylight left. As the sun set, the forest around us grew eerily quiet. No birds, no small animals rustling in the underbrush, just silence. Around 9 p.m. we heard it, 3 distinct wood knocks echoing from the ridge above us. Knock, 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 evenly spaced, definitely not natural. "Marco, this isn't good," I whispered. "That's not a woodpecker or a falling branch." Before he could respond, something hit our cookpot with enough force to knock it over and dent it. A rock about the size of a golf ball rolled away. Then another stone hit the ground near our tent. Not thrown randomly, these were aimed at our camp. What came next was worse. A smell so powerful and wrong it made my eyes water. It wasn't just the musky odor sometimes associated with Bigfoot sightings. This was chemical-like, a rotting smell that came in waves and burned the back of my throat. I've smelled dead animals before, but this was different, sharper, more acrid. We retreated to our tent as darkness fell completely. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to a slow, heavy pressure against the tent wall. Something was leaning against it. I could hear deep, deliberate breathing, and then a series of high-pitched throat clicks, unlike anything I've ever heard from human or animal. Marco was awake too, his eyes wide in the ambient moonlight filtering through the tent fabric. We lay perfectly still, barely breathing. The pressure increased slightly, like whatever it was wanted to feel if something living was inside. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before the pressure released and heavy footsteps moved away. "We're leaving at first light," I whispered once I thought it was gone. "Screw the rest of the route." Marco just nodded. We packed hastily at dawn, not even bothering with breakfast. As we shouldered our packs and began our descent toward the trailhead, I spotted movement on a ridge about 60 yards away. It was watching us, the same grey figure from before, partially hidden behind a windfall, but clearly tracking our movement. Throughout that entire day, as we hiked as fast as safely possible, it followed us. Sometimes we'd lose sight of it for an hour, then spot it again, perched on a rise or crouching behind a fallen tree. The forest would fall silent whenever it was near. Small animals would freeze or flee. It was like the woods themselves recognized a predator that didn't belong. Around midday, it changed tactics. We began hearing growls, not like a bear or cougar, but something so deep I could feel it in my spine before fully registering it in my ears. Then came the bluff charges. It would crash through underbrush toward us at incredible speed, only to pull up short of the trail. Testing us, I think now, seeing if we'd run. "Don't run," I kept telling Marco. "Whatever you do, don't run." By late afternoon, we were still miles from the ranger station, and I was genuinely afraid we wouldn't make it out before dark. We pushed ourselves harder than was probably safe, scrambling down steep sections, almost twisting ankles in our haste. The creature seemed to sense our growing panic. Its bluff charges grew closer each time. During one, I actually caught full sight of it running. A bizarre, loping gait, with those long arms held out slightly from its sides, not pumping like a human's would. It moved fast, unnaturally fast. The sun was setting when we finally spotted the ranger station in the distance. Our follower had disappeared about 30 minutes earlier, and I prayed it had given up. When we burst into the station, the warden looked up in surprise. We must have been a sight, exhausted, filthy, wild-eyed with fear. He gave us water while we caught our breath. When I finally explained what had happened, I expected skepticism or concern for our mental state. Instead, he took notes with surprising seriousness, asking detailed questions about locations and behavior. "You're not the first to report something in that basin," he said finally, his expression grim. "But you're the first ones who got out before it went bad." He wouldn't elaborate, just recommended we file a formal report and gave us directions to the nearest motel. We drove there in silence, both processing what he'd implied. That was 7 months ago. Marco and I have talked extensively about what happened, trying to make sense of it. We've researched Sasquatch encounters, read scientific papers on undiscovered primates, looked into every possible explanation. Nothing fits exactly what we saw. This wasn't the classic Bigfoot of popular culture. This was something else, something adapted to that specific wilderness, territorial and intelligent in ways that still make my skin crawl. I've been in the backcountry hundreds of times in my life. I know every conventional danger, bears, exposure, falls, floods. I know how to prepare for those, but how do you prepare for something that shouldn't exist? All I know is that I'm never going back to the Purcells. And if you're planning a trip there, especially off-trail in the more remote basins, please reconsider. Whatever stalked us for those 3 days wasn't just an animal protecting its territory. It was calculating, deliberate. And I'm convinced that if we hadn't gotten out when we did, no one would have ever found us. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I still hear those throat clicks and feel the pressure against the tent. I still see those wide-set, unblinking eyes reflecting dull gold in my flashlight beam, and I wonder how many other hikers have encountered it without living to tell the story. Story 13. I've never shared this publicly before. After all these years, I still get flustered and anxious when I think about it, but I figure it's time to finally put it down somewhere. Maybe someone else has seen the same thing. This happened in the summer of 2014. My wife, Sarah, our 4-year-old daughter, Emma, and I were spending a long weekend camping and hiking around Mount St. Helens. It was a place I'd wanted to visit since I was a kid, fascinated by volcanoes. We live in Portland, so it wasn't a huge trip, just about an hour-and-a-half drive. We'd had a great few days, and Emma was at that perfect age where everything in nature was magical and exciting. We'd packed up our campsite that morning and were heading home, driving south on Highway 503. It was around 2 in the afternoon, bright daylight, perfect visibility. The sky was that incredible clear blue you get in the Pacific Northwest during summer. Not a cloud. We had the windows down, radio playing some kid-friendly music Emma liked. Sarah was in the passenger seat looking at the photos we'd taken, and Emma was in her car seat in the back, half dozing from all the excitement of the weekend. The traffic was basically non-existent. We'd maybe passed 1 or 2 cars in the last half hour. It was just us on the road, surrounded by these incredible green forests and occasional meadows. I remember feeling really content in that moment, you know? One of those perfect family days. That's when Sarah said, "Did you see that? What the hell is that?" I looked over at her and her face had this confused expression. She was pointing out her window to the right side of the highway. I slowed the car down and followed her gaze. About 200 yards from the highway was a large meadow between two dense stands of trees. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just tall grass waving in the breeze. Then I saw movement. Something big was crossing the meadow, moving from one group of trees toward another. "What is that?" "A bear?" I asked, slowing the car even more. "I don't think so," Sarah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Dave, it's walking upright." I pulled over onto the shoulder and put the car in park. We both stared out the window. What I saw next made my skin go cold. It was unmistakably bipedal, walking on two legs, but it wasn't a person. This thing was moving with this weird loping gait. Its arms were swinging at its sides, and its torso was leaning slightly forward. The way it moved was both fluid and powerful, covering ground fast. The most bizarre detail, the thing that still makes me question my own memory, was that it was carrying something in its right hand. As it moved, I could clearly see it was holding what looked like a thick branch or root, about 2 feet long. There were these strands of smaller roots, or maybe bark, trailing behind as it walked. It wasn't dragging it, it was deliberately carrying it, like a tool or a weapon. "Dave, that's not a person," Sarah whispered. She had reached back and put her hand on Emma's leg, like she was making sure our daughter was still there. The thing was huge, not giant, but solid. I'd guess around 6 feet tall, but with these massive, powerful shoulders and long arms and legs. It was covered head to toe in thick, pitch-black hair, not fur exactly, but long, matted hair that hung especially thick around its shoulders and neck. It reminded me of the shaggy mane that hangs from a buffalo's throat. The hair seemed to cover its entire body, arms, and even the sides of its face. The only parts not covered in hair were around the eye sockets and bridge of the nose, where I could make out dark, leathery skin. Emma was still half asleep, but she must have sensed our tension because she started to stir. "What are you looking at?" she asked sleepily. Before either of us could answer, the creature suddenly stopped. It was maybe 100 yards from the road now, and it turned its head toward us. I swear to God it had noticed our car. The moment it spotted us, it changed direction, making this sharp, deliberate turn, and darted into the second group of trees. The speed was incredible. One moment it was in the meadow, the next it had vanished into the tree line. "Did you see that?" Sarah's voice was shaking. "Dave, that was a Sasquatch," I finished for her. I'd never believed in Bigfoot before. I always thought those stories were just misidentified bears or hoaxes. But what we'd just seen wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a person in a costume. "We should go," Sarah said, glancing at Emma, but I couldn't just drive away. This was potentially the discovery of a lifetime. "Let me just see if there's a way to get closer," I said, putting the car in drive. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Are you crazy? That thing could be dangerous." "I just want to look," I insisted. "We'll stay in the car. I'm just going to drive up a bit and see if there's a road that cuts over there." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. I drove slowly down the highway looking for access points. About a quarter-mile ahead, we found a small gravel side road that seemed to lead in the general direction of where the creature had disappeared. I turned onto the road, driving carefully to avoid the worst of the potholes. Emma was fully awake now, excited by the detour. "Are we going on an adventure?" she asked. "Just a little one, sweetie," Sarah replied, trying to sound normal despite the tension I could see in her posture. The gravel road curved through the trees for about a half-mile before opening into a clearing that seemed to connect to the meadow where we'd seen the creature. I parked the car and rolled down the windows, listening. The forest was eerily quiet. No bird calls, no insects buzzing, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "I don't think we should get out," Sarah said firmly. "I'm just going to take a quick look around," I said, already opening my door. "I'll stay close to the car." "Daddy, I want to come too." Emma started unfastening her car seat. No, sweetheart. You stay with Mommy, I said. I'll be right back. I stepped out of the car, feeling the crunch of gravel under my boots. The air felt different somehow, heavier, like before a storm. I walked a little way into the clearing, scanning the tree line for any movement. Nothing. After about 10 minutes of searching the area, I reluctantly returned to the car. Nothing? Sarah asked. I shook my head. Let's go back to where we first saw it. We drove back to the highway and returned to our original stopping point. I pulled over in the exact same spot where we'd first seen the creature. To our amazement, as we looked out over the meadow, there it was again, standing at the edge of the far tree line with its back to us. My heart started hammering in my chest. It came back, I whispered. Dave, please, let's just go, Sarah pleaded, but I was already opening my door. Stay here with Emma, I said. Lock the doors, I'll be careful. Before Sarah could protest further, I was out of the car and moving quietly toward the meadow. The grass was tall enough to reach my waist in some places, making my approach slower than I'd liked. I kept my eyes fixed on the creature the whole time, afraid it would disappear again. It was standing perfectly still, like a statue, its back still toward me. As I got closer, maybe 30 yards away, I could see more details. The hair along its spine was clumped in these thick ridges, almost like a mohawk. I could see its shoulder blades rising and falling slightly with each breath. The branch or root it had been carrying was now on the ground beside it. Up close, I could see it was actually a twisted piece of wood with dirt still clinging to the roots. I froze when I heard Sarah call my name from the car. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the meadow it carried. The creature's reaction was immediate but controlled. It didn't spin around or bolt. Instead, it partially turned its head, just enough that I could see one side of its face. One dark, deep-set eye fixing directly on me. That moment is burned into my memory. Its eye wasn't filled with rage or fear. It was something colder, more calculated, almost intelligent, like it was assessing me. The leathery skin around its eye crinkled slightly, and for a horrifying second, I thought it might be smiling. Then, without any visible hurry, it stepped forward into the tree line and vanished. I stood there frozen for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Then I sprinted to the spot where it had been standing. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there, pressed into the mud, were footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were huge, at least 14 inches long and about 4 inches across the heel. The impressions were deep, much deeper than the prints my boots were making, despite the fact that I weigh a solid 170 pounds. I placed my foot next to one print for comparison, and it dwarfed mine. I measured the stride by walking from one footprint to the next, heel to toe, and counted approximately 41 inches, at least 18 inches longer than my natural stride. I called for Sarah to bring the camera, but she refused to leave the car with Emma. Smart, honestly. I took a minute to examine the area more closely. There were broken twigs where it had entered the forest and some hair caught on a piece of bark. I carefully collected a few strands and put them in my pocket. When I returned to the car, Sarah was white as a sheet. "Did you see it up close?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, still trying to process what had happened. "Sarah, that was not a bear or a man in a costume. That was something else." We stayed in the area for another hour, driving up and down the highway and checking other access roads, but the creature had vanished. The forest had swallowed it completely. On the drive home, we talked about what we'd seen. Emma had fallen asleep again, oblivious to the magnitude of what had happened. Sarah and I agreed to tell people about it, but we knew how it would sound. We did report the sighting to a Bigfoot research group the next day, and they sent someone out to take plaster casts of the footprints. I gave them the hair samples too, though I never heard what became of them. That was 8 years ago, and I still think about it almost daily. I've gone back to that spot at least a dozen times since then, but I've never seen anything like it again. The footprints were gone the next time I visited, washed away by rain. The thing that still unsettles me the most wasn't just seeing a creature that supposedly doesn't exist. It was the way it looked at me, that calculating intelligence in its eye, and the fact that it was carrying something, using a tool. That's not animal behavior. That's something more. I don't know what we saw that day on the way back from Mount St. Helens, but I know it wasn't human, and it wasn't just an animal. Sometimes at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering, was it watching us the whole time we were camping? Was it curious about us the same way we were about it? And the question that really keeps me up at night, how many of them are out there in those forests, watching, waiting just beyond the tree line? Story 14. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or things that go bump in the night. I'm a practical guy. I work construction, I fish on weekends, and I don't waste time with ghost stories or cryptid nonsense. At least, that's who I was until November 18th, 2006. My fiancée Lisa and I had been together about a year at that point. She'd moved to Washington State to be with me, and I wanted to show her some of the local sights before winter really set in. That Saturday afternoon, I decided to take her for a drive up Spirit Lake Highway. Nothing fancy, just a chance to see some of the landscape and maybe catch a nice sunset view. The weather that day had been weird. Sunshine one minute, cloudy the next, with patches of mist rolling through. Typical Pacific Northwest mood swings. We'd spent most of the afternoon driving, stopping at little viewpoints, me pointing out landmarks and telling her about camping trips I'd taken in the area growing up. By the time we reached the upper part of Elk Meadows, it was already getting dark. I hadn't planned on being out that late, but time got away from us. The observation parking lot was empty when we pulled in. Not surprising given the hour and the unstable weather. I cut the engine, thinking we'd just sit for a few minutes before heading back down the mountain. The windows were cracked a couple inches to prevent them fogging up. We sat there in comfortable silence for maybe 5 minutes when I first heard it. It was this weird sound coming from the hillside across the highway. At first, I thought maybe it was just the wind in the trees or some animal I couldn't quite place. But then it got more distinct. Sort of a chattering noise, almost like what you'd hear from chimps at a zoo, but different, wilder somehow. The sound had this weird cadence to it, like it was directed at us. "Do you hear that?" I asked Lisa. She nodded, looking apprehensive. "What is it? A bird or something?" Before I could answer, the chattering was joined by another sound. A rhythmic knocking or pounding, like someone taking a rock and hitting it against another rock. At first it was just tap, tap, tap. Then it got faster, more urgent, and the chattering changed too. It became more intense, almost like whatever was making the sound was getting frustrated or agitated. I remember thinking it was strange because the sounds weren't random. They felt purposeful, like signals. "I'm just going to step out for a minute," I told Lisa, trying to sound casual. "Gotta take a leak." In reality, I wanted to listen more clearly and maybe see what was making those noises. "Are you serious? Just wait until we get back to town," she said. "It'll just take a second. Stay in the truck, okay?" Udogim. I opened my door and stepped out into the crisp night air. It was probably in the low 40s, and my breath made little clouds in front of my face. That's when everything changed. As soon as my feet hit the pavement, I heard something else. Footsteps. Not like an animal on 4 legs, but the distinctive pattern of something on 2 legs coming down the hillside toward us. I could hear dirt and small rocks being displaced, sliding down as whatever it was descended rapidly. My heart rate instantly doubled. I stood frozen by my open door, listening. These weren't the dainty steps of a deer or even the heavier movement of an elk. This was bipedal, unmistakably 2-legged and fast. Whatever it was in a hurry. "Richard," Lisa called from inside the truck. "What's wrong?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too focused on the sounds coming from across the highway. The footsteps had reached the bottom of the hillside and were now crossing the road. That's when I heard it behind our truck. Heavy, slapping footfalls like someone walking barefoot but with impossibly large feet. The sound passed about 40 feet behind us, heading toward the back of the parking lot. I didn't think. I jumped back in the truck, slammed my door, and cranked the ignition. Lisa was asking questions, but I was too focused on getting the headlights and fog lamps on. I threw the truck into reverse, then quickly shifted to drive, maneuvering to face whatever had just passed behind us. By the time I got the truck turned around with the lights pointing toward the back of the lot, all I caught was a glimpse. A large, dark figure vaulting over the concrete barrier at the rear of the parking area. It moved with incredible agility, pivoting on one hand like a gymnast over a pommel horse as it disappeared over the wall. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. "What the hell, Richard?" Lisa was practically yelling now, gripping the dashboard. "What just happened?" I don't know." My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "Did you see that?" "See what?" She looked terrified. "I just saw you freak out and start driving like a maniac." I realized she hadn't seen what I had. She'd been watching me, not looking out the back window. There was something out there. It just went over that wall. The way she looked at me, half concerned, half thinking I was nuts, made me second-guess myself for a split second. But I knew what I heard. I knew what I saw. "Wait here," I said, reaching for the door handle again. "Are you crazy? Don't go out there." She grabbed my arm. "I just want to check something. I'll be right back. Lock the doors." Before she could protest further, I was out of the truck again. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, just a small mag light, but better than nothing. I approached the area where I'd seen the figure cross, sweeping the beam back and forth across the wet pavement. And there they were, footprints, clear as day in the beam of my flashlight, pressed into the soft mud alongside the pavement. They were huge, easily half again larger than my size 12 boots. I placed my foot next to one for comparison and felt my stomach drop. Whatever made these prints wasn't just big, it was massive. I followed the trail with my light. The tracks came from the hillside, crossed the highway, went through the parking lot and ended at the concrete retaining wall, exactly where I'd seen the figure disappear. I tried to measure the stride by walking alongside the tracks. Each print was spaced about 4.5 feet apart. I had to take one long stride, plus a short step to match the distance between each footprint. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead despite the chilly air. No person could make strides like that. It wasn't possible. I heard Lisa honk the horn, 2 short beeps, our signal that she wanted me to come back immediately. I didn't need convincing. I jogged back to the truck, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. "We need to go," she said as soon as I got in. "Now." I nodded, put the truck in drive, and got us out of there as fast as I safely could on the winding mountain road. We didn't speak for the first few minutes. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. "What did you see out there?" Lisa finally asked, her voice quiet. "Footprints," I said. "Big ones. Really big ones. Like a bear." I shook my head. "Two-legged. Walking upright. A person? No person is that big, Lisa, and no person moves like that." I kept seeing that fluid movement as it vaulted over the wall, so athletic, so powerful. "So what are you saying? That it was—" She didn't finish the sentence. "I don't know what it was." But I did. Deep down, I did. I just couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. The entire incident had lasted maybe 10 minutes from the first chattering sounds to our hasty departure. 10 minutes that completely changed how I see the world. The next day, I wanted to go back, in daylight, to look at those tracks again, maybe take pictures. But Lisa refused to come. and I didn't want to go alone. By the time I convinced a buddy to go with me 3 days later, rain had washed away any evidence that might have remained. It's been years now, and I've told this story to very few people. Most react with skepticism or outright disbelief. I get it. I wouldn't have believed it either before that night. But sometimes, on cold November evenings, I find myself thinking about what happened at Elk Meadows, about those chattering vocalizations that seem so purposeful, about the rock knocking that responded to our presence, about those massive footprints in the mud and the impossible stride length between them. Most of all, I think about that dark figure vaulting over the concrete barrier with such ease, something far too large to move with such agility, yet doing exactly that right before my eyes. I'm still not the type to believe in monsters, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and I know that whatever was watching us from across that highway that night wasn't something science has properly explained. Lisa and I don't talk about it anymore. We got married the following summer, and we've built a good life together, but neither of us has been back to Spirit Lake Highway since that night. Some places once visited are better left alone. I don't have any grand conclusions or explanations. I just know that there's something out there in those woods, something intelligent enough to communicate, agile enough to move like no human could, and cautious enough to remain largely hidden from our world. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right, our paths cross in the darkness. If you're ever driving up Spirit Lake Highway as dusk approaches and you hear strange chattering sounds from the hillside, do yourself a favor. Keep your windows up, your doors locked, and don't stop driving until you're back among the lights of civilization. Some encounters you only want to have once in a lifetime. Story 15. I've debated for months whether to share this. Most people won't believe me anyway, but I need to get this off my chest. What my son and I encountered on our property back in 2011 has haunted me ever since. And the bizarre activity that's continued only confirms what I know to be true, even if I wish it wasn't. I live on a rural property in Brunswick County, Virginia, about 6 miles from Fort Pickett. My family has owned this land for 3 generations, 26 acres, mostly wooded with a clearing where our house sits. I always thought it was peaceful here until things started happening that I couldn't explain. It all came to a head on May 3rd, 2011. That night changed everything. For about 2 years before then, we'd been dealing with what I assumed was some persistent trespasser, or maybe a troublemaker from one of the neighboring properties. Someone would pound on our walls at night, usually after midnight. We'd find rocks that had been thrown at the house, and several times I found these large footprints in the soft dirt near our house, way too big for a normal person. These footprints always seemed to follow the same route, past the bamboo thicket I planted years ago, then heading into the woods. I'd assumed it was some local kid wearing oversized boots or something to freak us out. My wife Karen thought I was overreacting, but she hadn't seen everything I had. May 3rd started like any normal day. I worked my regular shift at the manufacturing plant, came home, had dinner with Karen and our son Mike, who was 21 and living at home while attending community college. Our daughter Amber was away at school in Richmond. It was a Tuesday, nothing special. I remember it was unusually warm for early May. We had all the windows open to catch the breeze. I went to bed around 10 and Karen followed about an hour later. Mike was still up playing video games in the living room. I fell asleep pretty quickly after a long day at work. At exactly 2:17 a.m., I remember checking my bedside clock. I was jolted awake by what sounded like a heavy thud against the back wall of our house. It wasn't like the usual pounding. This was more like something large had been thrown or had slammed itself into our house. The whole bedroom wall seemed to vibrate. "James, what was that?" Karen sat up, clutching the blanket. "I don't know," I said, already getting out of bed. "Stay here." I pulled on my jeans and grabbed my pistol from the lockbox in my closet. It's a Glock 19 that I keep for home protection. Living out here, police response time is at least 20 minutes on a good day. When I got to the hallway, Mike was already there, looking spooked. "Dad, something hit the house," he whispered. "I know," I said. "Get the shotgun." Mike nodded and went to get my Remington 870 from the gun cabinet. We kept it loaded with buckshot for home defense. In my mind, I was thinking it might be a bear. We'd had black bears around occasionally, though they usually didn't approach houses. My second thought was burglars, though why anyone would target our modest home was beyond me. Mike returned with the shotgun, and we moved to the back door. I remember my heart pounding as I flipped on the floodlights that illuminate our backyard. The lights only reach about 30 yards before the darkness of the woods takes over. "Stay behind me," I told Mike. "If it's a bear, just make noise and it'll run off." We stepped out onto the back porch, scanning the yard. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The night was quiet, except for the usual cricket sounds and occasional hoots from the barred owls that nest in our woods. That's when a deer, a young doe, burst from the tree line to our right, bounding across our yard at full speed. She was terrified, moving faster than I've ever seen a deer run, and disappeared into the woods on the other side of our property. "Something scared it," Mike whispered, clutching the shotgun. I nodded, my eyes fixed on the spot where the deer had emerged from the woods. The floodlights barely reached there, creating more shadows than illumination. Then I saw it. At first it was just movement, something large, shifting in the darkness at the edge of the woods. Then this figure stepped forward into the dim reach of our lights. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was enormous, standing at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was upright, on 2 legs, with a massive, bulky frame. In the poor lighting, all I could make out was its general shape: broad shoulders, long arms, and what appeared to be a head without a distinct neck, like it was sunk directly into those shoulders. "What the fuck is that?" Mike hissed beside me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth had gone completely dry. The figure just stood there for a moment, as if observing us. Then it took another step forward, now about 50 yards from our porch. Finding my voice, I yelled, "Stop right there!" My voice cracked embarrassingly, betraying my fear. What happened next still gives me nightmares. Instead of running away or freezing, this thing charged directly toward us, not in a lumbering way either. It moved with purpose, covering ground alarmingly fast. Pure panic shot through me. "Shoot it!" I yelled at Mike. "Shoot!" Mike raised the shotgun and fired a round in the creature's direction. The blast was deafening in the quiet night. I couldn't tell if he hit it or not. The distance was pretty far for effective buckshot range. The creature didn't fall or even slow down. Instead, it veered to my left, like it was trying to circle around us, coming at an angle rather than head-on. "Back in the house!" I screamed, already backpedaling toward the door. I raised my pistol and fired 2 shots, not really aiming in my panic, just trying to ward it off. We scrambled back through the door, but not before I got a slightly better look at the thing under the porch light. What I saw froze my blood. It was shaped like a man. If a man could be 8 feet tall with shoulders 3 feet wide, but it was covered entirely in hair, dark brown or black, with grayish patches visible on what I'd call its chest. Its face was partially obscured by the hair, but I could make out what looked like deeply set eyes reflecting the light. The proportions were all wrong, arms too long, legs too thick, and the smell. God, the smell, like wet animal fur mixed with something rotten and musky. We slammed the door behind us. Karen was standing in the hallway in her nightgown, eyes wide with terror. "What is it? What's happening?" she kept asking. I couldn't speak at first. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Mike engaged all 3 locks on the back door while I moved to the window, staying to the side so I wouldn't be visible from outside. The creature was still there, now standing about 20 yards from the house, just staring. For nearly 5 minutes it stood there, occasionally shifting its weight from one foot to the other. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and moved back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. "James, for God's sake, what was out there?" Karen demanded, shaking my arm. I turned to her, and I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because her expression changed from anger to concern. Mike later told me I was white as a sheet and shaking. I stammered. It was like some kind of big, hairy demon. That was all I could get out at the time. The words Bigfoot or Sasquatch wouldn't come to me then. They seemed too ridiculous, like something from a tabloid headline. We stayed up the rest of the night, huddled in the living room with all the lights on and guns at the ready. I called the sheriff's department, but I didn't tell them what we'd actually seen. Just that someone or something had tried to break in. They sent a deputy who arrived around 4:30 a.m., looked around the property with a flashlight, and found nothing suspicious. He clearly thought we'd overreacted to a deer or maybe a bear. When morning finally came, I ventured outside with Mike to investigate. What we found only confirmed my fears. There were footprints in the soft soil of Karen's vegetable garden, massive impressions measuring 18 to 20 inches long. They weren't bear tracks. I know what those look like. These were unmistakably foot-shaped, with 5 toes, but enormous and deeply pressed into the ground, suggesting whatever made them was extremely heavy. Following the tracks, we found tufts of brown and grey hair snagged on the barbed wire fence at the edge of our property. The hair was coarse, not like a deer or cow's hair, and certainly not human. But the most disturbing discovery came when we traced the creature's apparent path back toward the creek that runs through our property. About a quarter mile from the house, we found what looked like a crude tunnel dug into the embankment of the creek bed. The opening was about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, with fresh soil excavated around it. There were more of those massive footprints leading directly into it. Mike wanted to investigate the tunnel, but I stopped him. Something about it filled me with an instinctive dread. The thought of following those tracks into that dark hole made my skin crawl. That's when everything from the past few years suddenly clicked into place. The pounding on our walls weren't kids playing pranks. The tracks weren't someone wearing oversized boots. The missing garbage, the strange howls from the forest, it had all been this creature. I even remembered when my daughter Amber, before she left for college, had tearfully told us she'd seen a big, hairy man outside her window one night. We'd dismissed it as a bad dream. God, we'd made her sleep in that room for months afterward, telling her not to be silly. And there were other incidents too, things I'd rationalized away. Objects in our yard moved overnight. Food missing from our outdoor freezer after something broke the padlock. Once, our garbage was scattered across the yard, and I'd blamed raccoons. But the garbage had been inside our locked shed, and something had broken through the door to get to it. Over the next few days, I discreetly asked around the community if anyone else had experienced anything unusual. What I learned shocked me. Several neighbors, particularly those closer to Fort Pickett, shared similar stories of unexplained noises, damaged property, and enormous footprints. One elderly farmer even called it the Pickett creature and claimed it had been seen sporadically in the area for decades. Most surprising was when I ran into a military police officer from the base at our local hardware store. When I carefully broached the subject, he pulled me aside and told me that several training exercises had reported unauthorized personnel in restricted areas, only to find similar footprints and hair samples. He said it was unofficial policy not to document these incidents to avoid ridicule. It's been years since that night, but the encounters haven't stopped. We've reinforced our doors and windows. I installed motion-activated floodlights all around the property. We never go outside alone after dark. Sometimes I'll hear that same heavy footfall circling our house at night. Sometimes we'll find those massive tracks in the morning. Once, I caught a glimpse of something large moving through the tree line at dusk. Just a shadow, but enough to send me hurrying back inside. Mike moved out 6 months after the incident, claiming the constant stress was too much. Karen wants us to sell the property and move, but this land has been in my family for generations. And honestly, I'm not convinced it wouldn't follow us. I don't know what to call what we encountered that night. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some undiscovered species. All I know is that it was real. It was intelligent enough to try flanking tactics when threatened, and it's still out there watching our property. Every night when I lock our doors, I wonder if this will be the night it decides to come back. Not just to observe, but to retaliate for those shots we fired. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can feel it watching the house, waiting. And that tunnel in the creek bank, it's gotten bigger. Something's been digging.